Jaron Jarvis Channel, Top 20 Scary Stories of the Day from Reddit nosleep. 2018-09-09. Story 1, Dandelions. The first time I saw Brett, I was 19. I'd found a job working security at Dave's storage unit. My duties included keeping vagrants and thieves from disturbing the 40 rental units that were laid out in 5 neat rows in the middle of downtown Atlanta and helping customers with lost combinations for their locks. It wasn't the safest part of town to be working night shift, but it seemed to be easy work and the hours meshed nicely with my class schedule at the community college. I trained 2 shifts on days, and then showed up that Thursday at 10 p.m. for my first shift alone. Or so I thought. I arrived 10 minutes early. A guy in a Fallout Boys t-shirt sat at one desk playing solitaire and a girl with long blonde hair had her feet propped on the other, with a ball cap pulled down covering her face. "Hi," I said, when he looked up. "I'm Jason. New guy." "I'm Tom," he said, and started shoving stuff into a backpack. "Quiet day so far." "Good luck. The crazies come out at night." The girl lowered her hat and stared at me. She was the kind of beautiful that just stops a guy in his tracks. Big green eyes, full lips, flawless skin. I realized I was staring and mumbled a hi in her direction. Her eyes widened and she tipped her head in greeting. Tom looked up at me, eyebrows raised. "Yeah, so, all the keys are in the top drawer of that filing cabinet, along with a master list of the combination locks. Don't give anyone access unless they show 2 forms of ID and you make a copy of it. They'll fire your ass if you're not a stickler about that. And it has to be the person with their name on the contract, not a girlfriend, not a wifey. Some guy almost got canned because he let a wife in and she left with his whole stamp collection in the middle of a divorce. It was him," the girl said, and pointed at Tom. He ignored her, already heading toward the door. "See ya, wouldn't wanna be ya," he said. "Night shift sucks." The girl flipped him a bird and I laughed. Tom shot me a look I couldn't decipher, but then he gave a half-hearted wave and shut the door behind him. I looked at the row of monitors and then back at the girl. She hadn't taken her eyes off me and I felt awkward and flushed under her gaze. "I'm Jason," I said again, and immediately felt like an idiot. "Brett," she said, and leaned back in the chair. "Nice to have someone to talk to in this joint." "What about Tom?" I asked, sitting in the seat he'd vacated. She shook her head. "He's a tool." "So, are you second shift or third?" "I thought I was working alone." She shrugged. "Wherever they need me." I guessed they called her in to keep an eye on the new guy, and she didn't want to say she was supposed to babysit me. It was funny, because she seemed standoffish at first, but she was a talker and I loved to listen to her. By 4 a.m. it felt like I had known her forever, just one of those instant clicks and maybe even more so by the types of conversation people tend to have at those hours. We talked everything from childhood to politics. I think I was already falling a little in love with her. She saw me stretch and said, "You want to go outside? We can do a walk around." A cool breeze blew, but she didn't seem to notice. I couldn't stop sneaking glances at her as we walked. Faded jeans, scuffed boots, black t-shirt and a camo jacket. I probably had close to the same outfit in my closet, but on her, even the ordinary seemed beautiful. We walked the length of the first row and started down the second when she stopped and touched a bright yellow dandelion sprouting up through a crack in the sidewalk with the toe of her boot. "Those are my favorite flowers." I laughed. "Those are weeds." She smiled. "Those aren't weeds. They're wishes. Haven't you ever blown on one and made a wish? And even when they're yellow, that's my favorite color. They're such happy, hopeful little things." That made me smile, too. I'd never thought of them in that way. So many girls I knew seemed hung up on materialistic things, and Brett could find beauty in even this small flower. I was captivated. When we made it to the 4th row, she stopped. Her face pinched into a grim expression as she said, "I don't walk down this row." "Why?" I asked, taken aback by the look in her eyes. "Number 27. It gives me the creeps." It was the 3rd bay door, and it looked exactly like the first 2. I didn't understand, but I wanted her to smile again. Then we skipped this row. We finished walking the last row. A drink machine stood at the end of it and I asked her if she wanted one. She shook her head as I fed quarters into the slot. A payphone I hadn't noticed rang shrilly, making me jump. I laughed at myself and glanced at her. Brett's expression wiped away my smile. She looked terrified. "Don't answer it," she shouted. "Don't ever answer it." I gaped at her, not understanding. I won't, what's wrong?" She didn't answer. She started walking briskly back toward the office. I chased after her, my change and soft drink forgotten. "That phone rings every morning at 4:17, she said, as I opened the door for her. "When you answer it sounds like dead air, or there's some sort of hissing noise. It gives me the creeps. Probably some automated thing. Wrong number or something, but it's set on an auto program." She looked at me and said, "Do you believe in ghosts, Jason? You think a ghost is calling? Don't make fun of me." She snapped, "I'm sorry." I held up my hands in a gesture of surrender. "Do I believe in ghosts? Well, I haven't ever seen one." She made a scoffing noise, and I said, "But I won't rule them out. My grandmother believed in ghosts. She said she had the sight and swore that some people in our family could see them. Some had the gift of precognition, too. She was a very smart, reasonable lady." Mollified, Brett sat at the desk. "So, do you think everyone becomes a ghost when they die? Or do some move on to someplace else? Why would people be stuck here?" I shrugged. "Unfinished business? Violent death? I don't know." "What do you think?" She took a moment before responding. "Maybe the unfinished business. Maybe there just is nothing else." The easy vibe of our earlier conversation disappeared. She seemed anxious. Stressed. No matter what I tried to talk about, she seemed distracted. When Abe, the old guy on first shift, appeared to relieve us, she walked out the door without saying goodbye. I bid a hasty good morning to him and ran to catch up. I almost lost her, but I spied her head as she got on the train. It had been a long time since I had a MARTA pass, so I had to dig for the $2.50 fare. She frowned when I sat next to her in the back, and I realized I probably looked like creepy stalker guy. Too late now, but I didn't want her to be upset with me. "I really liked this girl. What are you doing?" she asked, and I wanted to run, but the train lurched forward. "I feel like I upset you and I'm sorry." She looked at an elderly lady in the next row, who was staring at us. Brett shook her head, like it was okay, but the lady got up and moved toward the front. "It's not you," Brett said. "But I don't want to talk about it." "Let's talk about dandelions then," I said. "They're my new favorite flower. Like you, pretty and magical." As corny as that was, she laughed, and our conversation slipped back into the same easiness it had before that payphone rang last night. At least, until the next stop. A lumbering bald man with beady dark eyes got on and took a seat a couple of rows in front of us. I saw Brett stiffen, though he didn't pay much attention to us at all. His gaze fixed on a pretty Latina who sat in the middle, playing on her smartphone. The rest of the ride, Brett never took her eyes off the man. He wasn't pleasant to look at, but I didn't understand her terror. "This is my stop," she said, and stood. The dark-haired girl also stood. "Brett," I said. Where are we? I need to get back to my motorcycle." She laughed then, the tension evaporating from her face. "You crazy boy. It will circle back around in about 6 more stops. I'll see you tonight." She waved and walked forward, giving the man a wide berth. For a moment, he looked like he was about to get behind them, and I was prepared to do so as well, so she'd feel safe, but he just sat there. Brett was already there when I arrived that night. She laughed when she saw the small bouquet of dandelions in my hand. Tom's eyebrows shot up. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "He left in record time. I don't think that guy likes me," I said. She waved her hand dismissively as I put the dandelions in water. "He doesn't like anyone. And thank you for the flowers. They're lovely." "So are you," I thought, but I didn't have the courage to say it yet. I wasn't about to bring up the guy on the train. I hated that tense, scared look she'd worn this morning. But to my surprise, she did. "That man is evil," she said. "Please don't ask me to explain how I know. I'm afraid he means to hurt that girl and I don't know how to stop him." My stomach dropped. "Brett, did he hurt you? We need to call the cops." She hesitated long enough to make me think he had, but she said, "No. I don't know. I can't remember things, and I'm scared to remember things. The phone makes me think of something but I push it back. Anyway, it's not about me now. It's about that girl." She took a deep breath. "Let's talk about it later. I don't want to think about it right now. I looked up dandelions between classes today," I said. "People in the 1800s used to blow on them after they went to seed. If all the seeds blew away, the object of your affection shared your feelings." I shook my head and gave her a pointed look. "You may not know it yet, but I think you're in love with me." She laughed, long and hard, and I grinned, pleased to see her happy again. Then her face got sad. "I wish I'd met you before, Jason." "What's wrong with now?" I asked, with uncharacteristic bravery. "You're not married, are you?" She shook her head. "No, but I'm not what you think I am. There are a lot of bad things, Josh. I don't want to explain, because I really like you. You're a beautiful girl with a weird taste in flowers. Think of all the money I'd save on Valentine's Day if you were my girlfriend." She laughed again. "Just keep talking to me. I hardly talk to anyone anymore, and you're so funny. Tell me about the motorcycle." "I'm glad you made it back to it." "I actually didn't come back to it this morning," I admitted with a laugh. "I got off the train and took an Uber to my place, then hitched a ride to school. Took the train back to work tonight. I was kinda hoping I'd see you. I had seen the creepy guy, but I didn't tell her that. Come outside and I'll show it to you." She walked around it, trailing her fingers on the gleaming blue paint. "It's pretty," she said, "but I don't like these things. They'll get you killed. I was hoping I could take you on a ride on it sometime." She gave me a glance that looked like a definite no, but said, "We'll see." Everything was fine until the phone began to ring at 4:17 a.m. I watched her face get that same terrified look and wondered what in the world had happened to her, and if it connected somehow to the creepy guy. Around time for the day shift guy to come on, she mentioned the guy on the train again. I don't know why, but I have the feeling he's going to do something to her, soon. I hate to ask, because I know you need sleep and go to class, but, would you ride the train with me again? "Of course," I said. Abe appeared at 6 on the dot. "Good morning, sunshine," he said, dropping his backpack onto a chair. "Good morning, Abe," Brett said. To me, she said, "I love that old guy." I chatted with him for a moment. Brett moved to the door and I said goodbye to Abe, intent on following her, when he called out, "Hey." His old face was pale when I glanced back. He pointed a shaky finger at the styrofoam cup filled with dandelions. "Where did these come from?" The look on his face spooked me. I wasn't sure what was happening. I picked them for Brett. The old man face went slack with shock. "You know Brett? You've seen her? Why world to look at her." She held out her hands in supplication. Tears streamed down her face. For the first time, I noticed she had on the same outfit as she had yesterday. "I'm sorry, Jason. I didn't know what to say." "Jason?" Abe asked, louder. I said, "Have you seen Brett?" I couldn't tear my gaze from her. "Apparently, your grandma wasn't the only one who had the gift," she said, and walked through the door. When I say, walked through the door, I mean right through it. A freaking solid metal, closed door. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Finally, I half fell onto one of the chairs. I heard Abe talking, but it was like he was speaking through a tunnel. It seemed like forever before I could focus on him. There was nothing I could say that wouldn't sound insane, so I didn't bother to sugarcoat. I said, "You didn't see her, just now, when you came in here." He shook his head, his roomy eyes huge. I told him about working with her, about some of the things she'd said. Even about the weird ringing phone. When I finished, he just stared at me. To be honest, "I don't know whether to believe you right now, or to call the cops," he said. I nodded. It was a fair statement. I don't know what I'd think, in his shoes. "She said you used to be a cop, before your wife got sick." I looked up at him. "She said you're the reason she loves dandelions. You told her about how your wife loved them, and how you decorated her hospital room with them before she died." Brett said it was the most romantic thing she'd ever heard. Abe sat heavily in the chair. "I did tell her that. Can I ask you to describe her for me?" I did, down to her scuffed boots, and he nodded. Then he reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a picture of her. It was Brett, all right, but on the missing poster. The clothing described as the last outfit she was seen wearing was what I'd seen her in. She went missing from her shift here, 6 months ago. I showed up and this place was wide open. There was a great deal of blood out by that payphone. The police never had any leads. I gestured at the row of monitors. One showed the drink machine and phone. What about the cameras? Installed after the fact. Because of her. Too little, too damn late. He leaned forward, giving me a hard stare. I loved that little girl. She was like a daughter to me. I've brought her dandelions myself. I have never believed in ghosts, but I saw your face this morning. I believe that you saw her, or you're some kind of nut and think you saw her. But I don't know how you know some of the things you know if that were the case. Brett and I worked together some, before we lost personnel and she got bumped to nights. I think she would have mentioned you, and I only told her the dandelion story right before she went missing. You could be the nut who took her, but I don't think so. I can't imagine why she'd share something like that with a person who would hurt her. If you see her again, ask her how much a mail-order bride costs." What? I felt like I'd fallen back down the rabbit hole again. Nothing made sense. I wondered if I was dreaming. "Just do it," Abe said. "Now go home. You look like shit." Only when I stumbled to the parking lot did I remember my promise to ride the train with her. I thought about Brett and the Latina girl. In fact, I skipped class and lay in my bed and thought about them all day. When I got to work that night, Tom was the only one there. Even though I still felt punch-drunk and scared, I had hoped Brett would be sitting there. Abe apparently hadn't told Tom about any of it, because he treated me with the same dismissiveness as always. It was weird to look back and realize he and Brett had never really spoken or interacted at all. I hadn't had a clue. By 4 a.m. I was getting a little stir-crazy, so I jumped up to walk around the storage buildings. I turned the corner of the last one and walked straight through Brett. I screamed like a little girl. She giggled a little, and clamped her hand over her mouth. "I'm sorry. Jason, are you real?" I demanded. "Am I crazy?" "I think I'm real," she said. "At least, I was. I know it sounds like I'm lying, but I don't remember much." She nodded at the payphone. "I remember this phone and it ringing. I think he used that to catch me off guard. I answered it and he hit me with something. I think she pinched the bridge of her nose. I think he's about to kill that girl on the train. Maybe I'm supposed to help her." Abruptly, she swung her fist at my arm and it passed right through. I yelped, "Stop doing that." "Despite everything," she laughed. "I was just checking. I don't know how I'm supposed to stop him when he can't see me and I can't touch him." She winked. "On the bright side, I bet you look crazy as hell on the security cameras right now." I scowled at her, then something occurred to me. I glanced at my phone. 4:20 a.m. Hey, the phone didn't ring. She shot it a scared look. "What does that mean? Are we on the right track, or are we running out of time?" I had no answer. The next morning when Abe came in, he gave me a wary look and said, "Is she here now?" I nodded and pointed at the chair she was sitting on. "Brett, how much does a mail-order bride cost?" She laughed. "Tell him I said, ask Ernie." I told him and his dark eyes teared up. "Brett, what happened to you?" He asked. "She doesn't remember, but we are trying to figure it out." I said, "Tell him Maggie still visits him. I've seen her around him. She's got a little girl she calls Bumblebee with her." I told him and he burst into tears. When he could finally speak, his voice was a gasp. "There's not a soul alive who knows that. Bumblebee was our daughter. She died back in 1974. I've never talked about her since. Jason, the train, she said, and I told Abe we had to go. Godspeed, son, he said. When we got on the train, the girl was already there. The bald man got on the same stop he had previously. His attention was once again fixed on her, but hers was once again fixed on her phone. I had no weapon and this guy was twice my size, but when I thought about him hurting Brett, or this stranger, I think I could have taken him down with pure adrenaline. We were about to find out, anyway, because this time when she stood, he stood too. It was still early, not a lot of folks out yet. We followed him, following her, trying to stay ducked out of sight. She paused outside a storefront and fumbled in her purse for her keys. That was the distraction he was waiting on. He charged her like a bull. It was terrifying, how quickly he seized her and dragged her into an alleyway. I ran blindly into the alley behind them. He had her pinned against the wall, his meaty hand around her throat. Hey! I screamed. Hey! Let her go. She still had her keys in her hand. While he gaped at me, she swung at his head with a vicious arc. She missed his eye, but the key dug into his cheek. The girl gave it a savage yank, opening up his face. With a bellow of pure rage, he dropped her and grabbed his ruined cheek. Blood spurted between his fingers and he ran straight at me. I made a desperate lunge for his legs, but he barreled past me straight into the pathway of a Mecco's milk truck. I'd hear the sound of that impact in my head for the rest of my life. A thudding, cracking, squelching sound. But I was glad. He'd never hurt another girl again. Brett was gone. I missed her terribly and hoped every day she'd reappear. I realized that was selfish and then I just hoped she was at peace. There was no grave to visit, so sometimes I'd gather little bouquets of dandelions and place them at the office, or at my apartment. Such happy, hopeful little things. 4 months after the incident with Edward Culpepper, that was his name. I'd followed the story avidly in the papers. I was getting a little overtime, helping Abe go through the stack of delinquent customers. Looks like we'll be cleaning out units number 27 and number 38, he said. Non-payment of rental fees. He tossed the copies of their agreements on the desk in front of me and I froze. Edward Culpepper's face stared up at me from the photocopy of his driver's license. Renter of unit number 27. Abe noticed my face and said, "Jason? Are you okay?" "That's him," I said. "That's the guy who killed Brett." I don't know why I didn't think of it before then. Her strange fear of that unit. Now it made sense. I told Abe and that old man moved faster than I did as we grabbed the combination for that lock. It took us a while, because the until was completely filled with old furniture and boxes of junk, but towards the back, we found a metal barrel. On the ground beside it lay Brett's army jacket. Abe grabbed my arm. "We are not opening that. We are calling the cops right now, do you understand me?" I let him pull me outside, because I didn't want to see her like that, either. Brett's body was finally laid to rest. With her mother's permission, and notice to the caretaker so he wouldn't try to kill them, Abe and I did some gardening work on her grave that next spring. Yellow dandelions covered it, looking as beautiful and sunny as the girl they memorialized. I think she would be pleased. 5 or 6 years passed. I graduated college, got a real job, fell in and out of love a couple of times, but I never really stopped thinking of her. Every time I saw a white dandelion, I picked it and made a wish. When I was in the area, I visited her grave and made sure she still had her cheery little offerings. One day, I was riding my motorcycle up near Nashville, enjoying a sunny summer day. I guess the driver of the Camaro didn't see me when he swerved around a semi to change lanes. I flew through the air and fell back down, hitting the ground with a bone-jarring thud. I lay there, conscious of sounds and light, but I couldn't move at all. I couldn't feel anything either, except for the heat of the sun on my face. I was disoriented, but I guessed I was in the median. Lying on grass, for sure, because there was a round, white dandelion inches from my nose. Blackness seeped at the edges of my peripheral vision. I couldn't blow on it, but I made a wish anyway, then passed out. When I came to, I still couldn't move, but I felt a little more Specifically, I felt someone nudging my side. I looked up to see Brett prodding me with the toe of her boot. "You gonna lie there all day?" she asked, and extended her hand. Surprisingly, my hand rose to grab hers and didn't pass through. She felt solid. Real. I wondered if I was in the hospital and this was some anesthesia-induced delirium. But the sun felt real enough. I even smelled burned rubber. I let her help me up, and I stood there for a moment, swaying. I saw my bike some yards away. "Crush tuck," I said. "Maybe I shouldn't move too much before the paramedics get here." She winced. "Yeah, about that." She pointed to the ground beside me. It was surreal to see my broken body lying there, staring sightlessly up at the sky. "Oh," I said. "Ouch." She shook her head. "I told you those things would kill you." "So, now what?" I asked. "Is there a bright light we walk towards or what? You're so calm. I like that about you." She shrugged. "If there's something we're supposed to be walking toward, I haven't found it yet. Maybe it's just me and you. Maybe it's my wish," I said, and she raised an eyebrow. "I made a wish right before I passed out, died, whatever." She scrunched up her nose. "Oh, yeah? Is that why I'm here? What was the wish?" "Just one I've wished 1,000 times now. You're really bad about responding to your ghost messages." I took her hands and made her face me. "Sorry, still getting the hang of this business." She waved her hand dismissively. "Such a rookie. But tell me, what was your wish?" "What I always wish that I could see you again someday, and do this," I said, and kissed her. I'm not sure how long we stood like that, kissing and holding each other while sirens screamed and traffic whizzed by on the other side of the median. Eventually, we started walking. I didn't know where we were going. Didn't care. All I knew was that I was with her, so I said, "Who's Ernie and what's this about a mail order bride?" Before she could tell me, a terrible cramp seized my body and I felt myself being tugged backwards. Brett frowned, her green eyes suddenly sad. "It's not your time," she said. "Stop fighting it." I didn't want to let go. I wanted to stay with her. But the tugging became a vacuum until I had no choice. I went hurtling backwards. I blinked and saw an ambulance worker standing over me. "There you are," he said as he popped up the stretcher I was somehow on. They loaded me onto the helicopter. I saw Brett standing over his shoulder. She held a dandelion in her hand. "It's okay, Jason," she said. "Some things are worth waiting for." Then she blew on the dandelion, making a wish. Story 2. My sister thinks her son is extremely gifted. But I fear something far more sinister is happening. His name is Matthew, but we usually call him Matty, and he is currently 8 years old. Matty is gifted at a level that is profound, almost eerie, and I'm not sure if there's ever been anyone like him. Maybe others out there who are reading this have known other extremely gifted children and maybe can share their experiences with them in the comment section below. I really am looking to gather as much information as I can. My sister, Susan, knew there was something different about Matty within a few months of his birth. At the age of 13 weeks he was already using basic words like yes, no, and mama, and he could put simple sentences together at the age of 5 months. I'm no expert in child development, but I've heard countless times that he acquired these abilities at an exceptionally early age. Almost supernatural. Some people just outright don't believe it. Imagine looking at a tiny little 5-month-old child, do you realize just how small they still are? And have him look at his mom and say, "I don't want to pee in my diaper. Want to go to potty." And he was toilet trained just like that. Never an accident since. Someone told me before that most babies don't even say the word mama until they are around 10 months old and don't potty train until about 1.5 years. And things just kept getting stranger with Matty. He somehow taught himself to read well before he had turned the age of 2. It started with just common words on street signs and billboards, but shortly after he turned 2 he started reading magazines and newspapers that he would find around the house. At this point, he was already speaking at about a grade 5 level. In preschool he was correcting the teacher's spelling while the other children in his class were still struggling not to pee their pants and to put three-word sentences together. He would sit with his preschool teachers at lunch because he claimed he found the other children boring. Until today, I hadn't seen Matty since he was first starting preschool. Almost 5 years ago now. I was visiting my sister back then to help comfort her as she tried to get past an unfortunate situation. Matty's father, who had always been entirely reliable and trustworthy, just up and left the family and has still to this day never returned. I remember asking my sister if there were any signs that he was unhappy. She replied that she couldn't think of anything. Things were going great. And then he was gone. He still sends money to the family, lots of it, and even writes the occasional letter to my sister. But there's never a mention, not even a word, about Matty. Shortly after that, I took a job on the other end of the country. I was always close with my sister growing up, and I hated that I couldn't see her regularly. Especially with her husband leaving and all. We were both just really busy. I kept thinking next year I'll go back home for a visit. But you know how it is. Something comes up. Besides, she still had my parents with her and a lot of close friends. I knew she would be fine. And we talked on the phone almost every week. Often we talked about Matty. About how he skipped grades 1 and 2. How by grade 3 he understood calculus, could speak basic Spanish and had written a novel. How he was always so well behaved and never ever got in trouble. I realized from these conversations how much I was missing out on. I was looking for an excuse to take a vacation from work and catch up with my family, which finally happened and is occurring in the present. I'm back in my family's hometown right now as I type this. And already I can tell you. I wish I never came. I arrived for dinner with my sister and Matty a few hours ago. My sister and I were so excited to see each other when she opened the front door. We hugged. We laughed. We asked and answered the regular questions customary of family who haven't seen each other in ages. And then Matty walked in the room. He took one look at me and I was immediately uncomfortable. He didn't seem to be looking at me. He was looking through me. We all probably know somebody with a huge personality who is a little intimidating to be around. I've experienced it before many times in life. But never with an 8-year-old boy. While his eyes seemed to say, I know everything about you. I know your flaws. I know it all, his voice and tone were very different. Hello, Uncle Philip. You look well. I had lost a lot of weight the past 5 years. He nodded at me in approval. And I hate to say it. But I loved the feeling it gave me. His approval. And the rest of our dinner went on awkwardly like that. A grown man dying for the approval of a fascinating little boy. It was so peculiar to hear an 8-year-old boy speak the way Matty does. I remember during the evening when he looked at me, almost through me again, and asked, tell me uncle. What Kool-Aid do you prefer? Red or blue? I didn't have a clue where he was going or what I should say. I don't really drink Kool-Aid, I replied. He looked disappointed at my answer. My sister smiled and said to me, I think he's asking who you voted for in 2016. As I started to answer, Matty waved his hand away, as if to show he was no longer interested in the conversation. That's how dinner went on for the rest of the evening. I remember feeling relief when Matty offered to clear the table. I offered to help with the dishes, but my sister and Matty both would have nothing of it. I was sitting in the living room browsing the internet on my phone while they finished up the dishes. Based on where I was sitting, I could see a mirror in the kitchen that reflected towards Matty doing the dishes at the sink. I was staring at him through that reflection, still puzzled by the things he said to me that evening. And then I heard my sister say to him, all right Matthew, finish up those dishes, then you need to get ready for bed. Oh, really? He asked. It was the first time he sounded somewhat close to an actual child. But Uncle Philip is here, and I thought. You know the rules, she interrupted. Then she left the kitchen. And that's when I saw, through the reflection of the mirror in the kitchen, Matty's face began to change drastically. It became bright red and, I promise you this is what I saw, his head seemed to grow in size. His eyes bulged out and his ears appeared to grow pointy. He grabbed a large knife from the sink and stabbed it quickly and violently in the direction towards where his mother had left the room. Matty thought he was alone in the kitchen and that nobody could see him. But I actually saw the realization written all over his face when he remembered the mirror. He looked at it quickly and locked eyes with me. He knew I saw. I tried to look away, but I felt compelled to keep staring at him. He smiled at me, still with that deranged inhuman-looking face. Then he raised the knife that was still in his hands and held it towards me in the mirror. I had no idea what he was doing. Would he cut himself? Would he charge into the living room and attack me? Instead, he quickly raised the knife up to his neck and cut deeply. He had punctured a carotid artery and blood squirted all around the kitchen. He stared at me with that same smile on his face the entire time. I felt like screaming, but I seemed frozen in place. An impossible amount of blood was spreading all over the kitchen. I wanted to close my eyes so badly but was struggling. But I felt myself regaining control. With great effort, I was able to fully shut my eyes. And less than a second after that I felt a tap on my shoulder. I opened my eyes and saw Matty standing right in front of me. There was no cut on his neck. There was no blood. He spoke to me. "Mommy says I have to go to bed. Goodbye, Uncle Philip." And then he walked out of the room and up the stairs. When my sister returned to the living room I made up an excuse and abruptly left her house. I remember walking across the driveway towards my car and having the uncanny feeling that somebody was watching me. I turned quickly to look up towards Matty's window, almost sure he'd be looking down at me with that smile on his face. But there was nothing there. I got in my car and started driving to my hotel, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched for the entire drive. I arrived at my room and sat on the bed, trying to gather my thoughts. I had halfway convinced myself that maybe it was all in my head. My mind had just been playing tricks on me while I was looking at Matty's reflection in that mirror. And that's when the phone rang. I couldn't figure out who on earth would be calling me in my hotel room. Who even knew I was here? I picked up the phone and held it to my ear, and said hello, almost certain that it would be the voice of Matty that would respond. But it wasn't Matty. It was a grown adult. "You saw something at that house tonight, didn't you?" I recognized the voice, but couldn't place it. He spoke again. "Tell the truth. Matty did something, didn't he?" And then I figured it out. "John?" I asked. "My sister's ex-husband and Matty's father who had run out on them." "Wait, was that you watching me when I left the house? Did you follow me here?" "I saw something all those years ago, Philip. And I saw the look on your face when you left that house tonight. Something happened." I started speaking again, but he cut me off. "You should stay away, Philip. You should never go back there." "You." "Wait a second," I interrupted. "Is that why you left them all those years ago? What did you see?" "I saw evil, Philip." He paused and started breathing heavily. He said one more sentence and then hung up the phone. "I saw pure evil." Story 3, that babysitting job. Maybe it's terrible, but there's not much else to do when you're babysitting and the kids have gone to sleep except Snoop. I know, it's not the most professional thing to do, but I was 13 when I started babysitting and I was 17 when I stopped. The last job I remember having was for a family I babysat for often, the Stantons. The Stantons were a cute family, very typical. Either Ronnie or Jane always dropped me home since it was late when they came back. They made awkward jokes about their kids being crazy, though they were definitely a handful, and idle small talk about how school was going. They had me over every couple of weeks or so, which I thought was cute. It must have been hard to get away for a night when you've got 4 kids under the age of 10, but they always paid well, giving more than other families did. On the whole, I enjoyed sitting for them, since their kids went to bed much easier than a lot of other kids did, even if they did leave me exhausted with all of their imaginative games. Anyway, it was a normal night at the cozy Stanton home. I was flopped on the couch, tiredly scrolling through my phone after managing to wrangle the kids into bed. They were obsessed with playing cops and robbers, though there was always a very detailed shootout at the end, unlike the typical chasing game. Like I said, the kids were a handful. When my feed became too boring and itch to snoop around called me, I had to follow it. A bad habit, I know. All the lamps were turned on and the curtains drawn shut. The thought of looking out a window and seeing a face staring back at me had been a fear of mine ever since my uncle had scared the life out of me when I was a kid. I started with the kitchen, looking through the cabinets and the fridge. Almond milk and avocados, of course. Looking through random drawers as I went, I made my way to the one room that I hadn't dared explore before, the master bedroom. I stopped outside Ronnie and Jane's bedroom at least once during every snoop session, but I hadn't dared to go in. It seemed like too much of an invasion of privacy, and a part of me knew that since they came across so normal, they were probably into kinky stuff, which wasn't exactly something I was eager to stumble upon. But the school year was drawing to a close, my birthday was fast approaching, and I'd be leaving for college at the end of the summer. There was no time like to present. So, drawing a deep breath, I turned the handle and stepped inside. Lo and behold, it was normal. There was a king-size bed in the middle of the room, pressed against the back wall, adorned with way too many throw pillows. There was a door either side, but I started with the 2 nightstands. There was nothing interesting, everything you'd expect of a 30-something couple with 4 kids who weren't looking to have any more. With a disappointed, yet sort of relieved sigh, I checked the first door. It was only an ensuite filled with normal hygiene products. I was expecting something a little more interesting. So I checked the second door. A walk-in closet. How interesting. With another sigh, I rifled through the racks of clothes, admiring the pretty, office-ready dresses and suits, when I noticed something odd lying behind Ronnie's side of the room. Pushing the clothes as far apart as I could, I squeezed between the stuffed rails, ran my fingers over the door of the safe. Finally. It seemed like a long shot that I would be able to guess the 4-digit code, and I wasn't sure how many attempts I got before some security thing happened. On a whim, I typed in their alarm code, a necessity for the few nights when they were getting back at the early hours of the morning, so I slept in the guest room. A soft beep seemed to screech in the silence, and the numbers turned from red to green. My heart was racing, my eyes wide as a smile slowly spread across my lips. I twisted the lock and pulled the heavy door open. The thick, manila envelopes were unsealed and lined 2/3 of the way across the safe. The smile stayed on my lips until I opened the first one. It was filled with pictures of a girl. They looked like printouts of Facebook and Instagram pictures of a girl. She was beautiful with long, blonde hair and a contagious smile. Then I found the crisp sheet of legal pad paper with the curly handwriting of Jane Stanton. The girl's name was Mandy Reeves, she was 18, lives a few towns over. Then there was a schedule of her Friday night. What followed made the blood drain from my face. It was slow, like my brain didn't actually want to comprehend what it was seeing, but my body knew. There were more pictures of her. Her face was contorted in horror, her eyes filled with fear-stricken tears. There were pictures of her bloodied, bruised, naked. There were pictures of her and Ronnie, a sick smile on his face. There were pictures of her and Jane, the girl strapped down with what looked like duct tape so she couldn't escape what the suburban mother of 4 was doing to her. The last picture was Mandy Reeves, her eyes shut, her skin pale, her arms crossed, a posed corpse. My hands shook as took the next envelope out. Another girl, 18, more pictures. And another girl. And another one. And another. My hand covered my mouth, begging the vomit to stay inside. I couldn't let them know. I couldn't let them know that I'd been here, that I'd seen it. I knew I had to call the police, but the morbid curiosity made me look through each envelope until I saw the last. This one didn't have nearly as many pictures, only the before ones, before they broke the girl's body, defiled her in their increasingly creative ways. It just had the social media pictures and the schedule. My hands muffled the scream, hot tears flowing down my icy cheeks. It was me. They were waiting for me, grooming me, making my schedule as they waited for my birthday to arrive. My birthday when I'd be 18. The police were waiting at the house when the Stantons arrived home that evening. I was sitting in the back of an undercover car with two officers in the front seats. My parents were on their way. They were oblivious to the fact that I wasn't innocently waiting for them to drop me home when they arrived. There wasn't a dramatic shootout. They were just taken in handcuffs as soon as they'd entered their home. I haven't babysat since then. I haven't looked at suburban couples the same. My therapist says I've been traumatized. I laugh, that's the least of my worries. A new family moved in across the street, they have 3 kids. My therapist says it might be a good idea to agree to their request and babysit. Story 4, if you see one of these, burnt it ASAP. My name is Bella. I live on the northern coast of Salem, Massachusetts. I guess that statement alone pretty much sums up and solves what I'm about to tell you, doesn't it? Salem is a pretty weird place, known mostly for the witch trials back in 1693. I'm sure you've heard of all kinds of weird stories and happenings taking place in Salem. I'm pretty sure my story takes the cake, though. The events of my tale started a couple months ago, but I'm only just now starting to come to terms with what happened and move on. I'm hoping that writing this will help some, and will help you know what to do should you encounter what I did. I invited my mother over so she could bear witness to what I plan to do after I finish this post. She's watching me type this as we speak. Mom says, "Hey, P. 2 months ago, I was out and about in town doing some shopping. I love to collect antique stuff, paintings, lamps, decorations, etc., and decided that I would add a new item to my collection. I decided to go to a new antique shop that had opened a few days prior and see what they had for sale. As to be expected, they had a vast array of old items displayed on shelves. A few items caught my eye and I gave them a good look over. I decided not get them, so I moved on. What caught my attention next was an ornate box. It was rectangular, kind of like a book. It looked to be roughly 7 inches wide, roughly 10 inches long and looked to be a little over an inch thick. The majority of the box was black, but did have some cute markings on it. The little pegs that held it up were made of either brass or copper shaped to look like little upside-down crosses. I found that part of the box to be a little weird, and an uneasy feeling had started up in the pit of my stomach. I ignored it and continued to look at the box. On top of the black around the edges of the lid and around the sides, intricate swirls and flower shapes and dots were painted on in shades of white, peach and pastel green. In the middle of the box's lid was a painting depicting an angel weeping as it read a book. On one side of the box, there was a small brass latch with a tiny, rusted metal padlock attached to it. Turning the box over, I found the bottom was unpainted. Also underneath was the key for the padlock taped to it with some kind of clear tape, probably scotch. I remember picking up the box and taking it over to the counter. The lady that stood behind it seemed to be in her late 60s, early 70s. Her hair was mostly dark brown with quite a few grey hairs, pulled back into a neat bun. Her somewhat wrinkled face was dotted with brown freckles, and a couple of moles near her mouth. The rest of her wasn't as wrinkly and just a little saggy. I remember she wore a long, short-sleeved blue dress with pink peonies and green leaves. I'm sure she was wearing shoes to match, but I was unable to see them from where I stood. I sat the box on the counter and the lady seemed pleased that it was being sold. She introduced herself as Barbara, the owner of the store. She then went on to explain that the box had just arrived a few hours ago, delivered by a man who seemed rather eager and frantic to sell it and get it out of his possession. Barbara wasn't sure why he was so eager to sell it, but said all that was inside was a book, one with empty pages. She couldn't understand why he would make such a stink about an empty book, but she bought it from him anyways. The uneasy feeling in my stomach grew, but at the same time, my curiosity was heightened. I asked about the price of the box and the book it contained, and ended up buying it for a mere $25. I said goodbye to Barbara and went home. As soon as I got home, I went straight to my favorite reading chair in the corner of my living room. It was a reclining chair with soft blue fabric. I climbed into the chair and got comfortable. I pulled the key from off the bottom of the box and discarded the tape on the nearby coffee table. With no hesitation, I unlocked the box, pulled out the book and then placed the box on the coffee table next to the tape. The book was hard-covered, black and accented with thin gold strips close the edges and down the spine. The inside corners on the front and back made by the gold strips were decorated with intricate gold patterns. The back of the book was void of any words, but the front contained the title A Paper Mirror in big, white capitalized letters. From the outside, the pages appeared to be yellowed with age. Flipping the book open to the first page, I was greeted by the following. Bella, filled with curiosity, opened up the book. It was a bit of a shock to see her name printed on the page. Though certainly there was a reasonable explanation for it. It could have been that she had simply misread the page. It could have been that the story Barbara had told her of the book's previous owner had her mind all spooked and stirred up. Or maybe somebody else who once had the book simply shared the same name as her, and the book bought from the antique store was really meant for her. For reasons known only to her, Bella continued to read the book. Why the fuck not? After all, there was no possible way, no guarantee, that the words on this page were referring to her. It was merely just a paper mirror, a simple reflection of words made up on the pages of a book older than Lincoln. The only way to know for sure if the book was really about Bella, was to simply turn the page and continue reading. I was absolutely bewildered. It was like the book was talking about me. It even seemed to imply that it was. I shook my head to clear my thoughts and turned to the next page with a shaky hand. I was scared of what I would read next, but my curiosity had gotten the better of me and willed me to keep going. I stared at the next page with disbelief, as bewildered as she was, and although she was shaking, Bella bravely turned the page and continued to read her paper mirror. Even if she decided to read the book to its end, there was no reason for Bella to take the book's words seriously. At some point, she would get bored or too frightened to open the book again, and would end up selling it to some sucker working in a stuffy antique store, or she'd simply forget about the book and the box altogether, and that would be the end of it. But Bella would soon finish this page and read the adjacent one, and eventually turn the page to the next and the one after that, and the one after that. She would continue reading, learning of her fate. Bella would learn of how her life would play out and how it would end. Did she really want to know? Not really, but there was a small part of her willing her to go on, and go on she did. The uneasy feeling in her stomach grew, and even more so after reading a certain paragraph on this page. She beginning to feel unnerved, unsafe even. How was this happening? That was a question with no answer. No explanation Bella thought of would satisfy it. I shuddered as I closed the book. I tossed it onto the coffee table and went outside to get some fresh air, hoping it would calm my nerves. It was almost as if the book was a fortune teller looking into the crystal ball that was all about me. The book was right. However, I didn't have an explanation for why it was happening, and even now I still can't explain it. Did that book, that paper mirror, actually know how my life was going to go? What I'd do, who I'd meet or married, tell me if I had kids and what they were like? Would it really tell me how I was going to die and when? Well, of course, there was only one way to find out, and the book already knew what I was going to do. I sighed defeatedly and went back inside my house. I grabbed the book and sat back down in my comfy chair, but didn't bother to make myself nice and comfortable. I cracked open the book and flipped through pages, skimming over the words. Every page was detailed with things I would do, the things I would say, and where I was and who was to witness them. It even had pictures at certain places. I came across a page with a picture of my mother, a date and a paragraph depicting her death and how I handled it. A few pages from that was one about my father, written in the same way. The next 20 or so pages were filled with words I hardly bothered to read. I stopped at a page that contained only 2 pictures, 2 dates and a brief summary of what was happening. The top one showed a handsome man standing next to me. He was taller than I was, and had dark, chiseled features. His hair was brown, short and messy. He wore a flannel shirt and a pair of jeans along with a pair of boots. The date below it was 6 years from the day I got the book, and had the following description: Bella met Lou on this day. He would later become the love of her life, and she knew he was the right one for her. The picture below it depicted Lou on one knee proposing to me one day a couple years later. The description matched and noted that I would go to my parents' graves to tell them the news. On the adjacent page were pictures of the wedding. More wedding photos, dates and descriptions followed. As I flipped through the pages, the pictures turned back to words detailing how my life was going to be like at that point. As I was nearing the end, a good 40 pages left at the very least, my life turned into a tragedy. One of the 4 kids I was destined to have died from an asthma attack. Not even 3 weeks later, the remaining 3 were involved in a fatal car accident with Lou's mother, where all persons involved died. Life at the point in the book was hard for me. As I read it, I couldn't help but shed tears knowing my kids would die. As I turned the next page, I discovered that Lou fell into a depression and eventually wound up committing suicide by poisoning himself with carbon monoxide in an empty parking lot in his truck not long after he had gotten off work. My heart wrenched in my chest as my stomach turned. My future life was going to be god-awful, but perhaps knowing how it would turn out would allow me to change it. I took in a long, shaky breath and slowly let it out as I continued to turn the pages. My future life was a slow downward spiral from Lou's death until the end. According to the paper Mirror, Lou's death was to send me into an alcohol-fueled, drug-laced depression. I was to take a lot of drugs, become a drunk, nearly overdose on a number of occasions and have a great number of run-ins with the law. My life would end with me escaping prison, attempting to cross a train bridge and meeting my doom when an oncoming train flattened me, ripped my skin to shreds, shattered every bone and splattered every organ in my body. I remembered I screamed and threw the book down after learning how I was to die. I also remember spending the next 2 hours in a complete state of panic and dismay. I calmed down a bit after taking a quick, cold shower. Afterwards, I went back to the book and locked it back in the box. I then hid it in the attic of my house, a place I knew I wouldn't go off in, a place I knew I wouldn't see the box or that damned book for a long while. From the day I hid the box until now, I spent my life scared and cautious of everything. It was really hard on my life. It was hard on my job, on my family and on my friends. They all wanted to know what was wrong, but there was no way in hell I would ever bring myself to let them read that book, my paper mirror. There was no way of telling them, of explaining it without showing them that damned, wretched book. Now, however, I feel that I'm ready to move on. I've grown tired of living my life in fear. I've got the book in my lap. Its box is sitting next to my computer. I plan on burning the book, but it turned out the book was wrong. Bella wasn't going to die from being squashed under a train. Bella wasn't going to endure the loss of her children or the loss of her husband. Bella wasn't going to end up a druggie or an alcoholic. Instead, Bella was going to end up dead the day she typed every part of this Reddit post but these final paragraphs. She took a break, you see. Her fingers were hurting a bit and she looked as if she was going to cry. She went to the window, paper mirror in hand, and stared out into the semi-quiet street. A man walked by on the side of the road, the man from her book, the one she was to marry. Bella thought it was a good idea to go tell Lou of their fate. We'll never know why, because Bella was ran over by a drunk driver barreling down the road. After calling for an ambulance, her mother went outside to her body, shaken, shocked and heartbroken. In her hand, she still clutched that book, that goddamned paper mirror. After prying it from her still warm hand, I opened the book to see if her fate had changed. Of course it had, but all that was written was 3 agonizing sentences. Bella thought if she knew of her fate, she could change it and avoid the awful twists the paper mirror had in store. Silly Bella was wrong and now she's dead, hit by a drunk driver and splattered like roadkill. Silly, silly Bella, do you prefer to be splattered by cars rather than trains? Bella was pronounced dead at the scene. The drunk driver was arrested and Lou shared his eyewitness account with the police. After talking with them, I stumbled back inside and came back to this computer. I'm finishing this post for my dearest Bella. If you come across a paper mirror, don't even open it. Burn it immediately. Please don't end up like Bella. Silly, silly Bella. Story 5, Junie. As a teacher, you get to know hundreds if not thousands of students over the course of your career. Along the way, you might acquire some stories. I certainly have a few. Most of them are pretty basic. Kid sleeps through class all semester and then begs for extra credit after failing the finals. Kid prints an essay off the internet and turns it in with their name scribbled in the corner. My favorite was the guy who never showed up for class and on the last day of school, tried to bribe me with weed for an A. Yes, he actually brought a bag of weed to school with him and showed it to me. He was not a smart cookie. I thought when I switched to teaching kindergarten, the drama would go down to a simmer, if not stop altogether. The chief concerns among my new students were snack time and getting the last purple crayon out of the box. Compared to the hormonal teenagers I was used to, it should have been a walk in the park, and for the first few years, it was. Then I met Lily Barrett. On the first day of school, I gathered all the kids in a circle to play an icebreaker game. Everyone had to stand up and tell the class their name, birthday, and something they like. I've always enjoyed playing this game, even though as time goes by, the answers get somewhat predictable. My name is Timmy. My birthday is August 1st, and I like dinosaurs. My name is Marie. My birthday is March 17th, and I like chocolate bars. Just to name a few. But I still go through it every year. As a mother to my own inquisitive toddler, I know how important it is to show kids you care about their interests. Even if it's not something you know or care about, fake it until you make it. Give them that little boost of confidence early on, and they'll carry it with them for the rest of their lives. I introduced myself first. Hi, my name is Ms. Carson. I was born on December 29th, and I like reading. I passed it off to the boy on my right, and we went around the circle. Some answers were more surprising than others. I wasn't expecting the dimple-cheeked girl with a bright pink dress and pigtails to be a WWF fan, but I guess parents will let their kids watch anything these days. Everything was normal as we moved around the circle, the children speaking with varying levels of enthusiasm and discovering new friends who shared their passion for cotton candy and My Little Pony. The last person to speak was a little brown-haired girl with glasses. Now when I say she was little, I mean little, even for a kindergartner. For a second, I thought she was in the wrong place and wanted the preschool down the street, but no. I found out later she was actually one of the older kids in class. When her turn came, she stood on wobbly legs. They were roughly the same width as a pencil, so thin I thought for sure they'd snap from holding her body up high. I'm Lily Barrett, she said with a smile. My birthday is September 21st, and I like kittens. That's great, Lily, I said. I used to have a cat myself. All right, now that everyone has, but sometimes I'm Junie, Lily continued, as if I hadn't said a word. Junie doesn't really have a birthday, but she likes kittens, too. She also likes trees. A few kids stared, and a few more laughed. But none of it fazed Lily in the slightest. She sat back down, playing with an old Barbie doll without a care in the world. Okay, thank you Lily. I clapped my hands together, putting on my patented cheerful kindergarten teacher smile. So, now that we've all gotten to know each other, how about we do some coloring? Now I'm sure you're thinking Lily drew bloody corpses or six-armed monsters with 8 rows of teeth that day, but no. She drew flowers. In fact, for the next few months, she was as normal a kindergartner as you could hope to find. She wasn't a brainiac or a social butterfly, but she got good marks and had a small group of friends. She never mentioned Junie again, at least not to me. Once in a while, when it was my turn to monitor the kids at recess, I'd overhear her telling a friend not to climb on top of the jungle gym or jump off the slide because Junie said it's dangerous. Once during art class, I asked everyone to draw a picture of themselves with their best friend. Lily produced a crayon image of herself walking hand in hand with an identical little girl. The only difference was one had a capital L on their shirt. The other had a J. Junie looks like me because she lives in my head, Lily casually explained as I looked over her work. To be honest, I wasn't bothered at the time. Sure, it was weird. But she was 5 years old. When I was 5, I used to talk to my mother's ceramic goose that she kept on the coffee table. I even had a full backstory for where he was born and what his family was like and how he came to be a fixture in my childhood home. I never wrote it down, so I don't remember most of it, but trust me, it was extensive. So a kid with an imaginary friend? No big deal. I can handle it. And even if I couldn't, I had enough going on in my personal life. My divorce was getting ugly as my soon-to-be ex-husband dragged his feet about custody arrangements. Every second not spent grading papers or taking care of my son was spent on the phone with my lawyer, going over whatever bullshit my ex had pulled this week to delay the proceedings. At school, I threw myself into the role of a nurturing educator, but I know a few kids slipped through the cracks. It never occurred to me that Junie might be anything to worry about until Parents' Night. Most of you who came out of the public school system probably remember Parents' Night. It's the night your parents come and see all the progress you've made. It's also when I get to listen to entitled soccer mums and executive dads tell me what a prodigy their kid is, so how dare I not praise them every second and lick the dirt off their shoes when they come in from recess. How can I even think to call myself an educator, blah blah blah. Oh God, just thinking about it makes my stomach turn. To be fair, kindergarten parents aren't that bad about this, or so I've been told. Mostly they just want to make sure their kids get a milk carton at snack time and have their artistic masterpieces on the bulletin board where they belong. I just finished talking to one couple when I noticed a woman standing next to Lily's chair. I assumed it was her mother, though they didn't look anything alike. Where Lily was a skinny brunette, this woman was curvy with bright red hair and snow-white skin. I went over to introduce myself. "Hi, I'm Ms. Carson, Lily's teacher," I said, shaking her hand. "Nice to meet you. I'm Melissa, Lily's aunt. Lily's told us so many good things about you." The conversation from here was basic small talk. I found out that Lily had spoken highly of her new school and loved everything about it. She was just as energetic and bubbly at home as she was in the classroom and had decided she wanted to be a teacher when she grew up. That part was nice to hear. Though one question niggled me, I wasn't sure when it would be appropriate to ask, or if it would be at all, so this was her me and my best friend project. The way I held the drawing, my fingers covered Junie's face. She decided to go in a bit of a different direction. Melissa frowned as she took the drawing. Not in an angry way, I don't think. More resigned? Or regretful maybe? I'm no expert in body language, but I could tell she wasn't happy. "I guess she's told you about Junie," she said. "This isn't new for her. She's been talking to Junie since long before she came to live with us." Then she launched into one of the most tragic stories I've ever heard. Melissa's husband was the brother of Lily's mom. Lily's father was a businessman, smart, good-looking, and well-liked by his peers. He was also a monster, beating his wife if she did even the slightest thing wrong. Lily never felt the brunt of his abuse, but she was forced to bear witness to all of her mother's suffering. That's when Melissa thinks she started talking to Junie. Having an imaginary friend to protect her made her feel in control. Like she had someone to protect her. One night, Mr. Barrett took it too far. Mrs. Barrett had overcooked dinner, so he pushed her down the stairs. She broke her neck and died in agony. A few days later, he had a nervous breakdown and was committed to a mental hospital. He'd claimed his wife's death was accidental, but the police suspected foul play, and his friends were finally opening their eyes to what kind of man he really was. They say he was completely insane when he died. Kept screaming about bugs crawling out of his ears and gnarled, branch-like hands digging into his chest and ripping his organs apart. It wasn't long before his heart gave out under the stress. Couldn't have happened to a nicer man. Lily went to live with her aunt and uncle. They lived several states away, giving her a fresh start after all the pain she'd endured. By all accounts, she was doing well. She ate right, got along with her cousins, and discovered a passion for collecting rocks and making pyramids in the backyard. She barely remembered what happened to her parents, and her family hoped to keep it that way for as long as possible. The only relic left over from her past was Junie, and it didn't look like she'd give that up anytime soon. After that night, I paid extra close attention to Lily in class. I don't want to say I hovered, but I did praise her a little more than perhaps was necessary. I just wanted her to feel special, you know. Every now and then, I wanted to ask about Junie, but I always held my tongue. Now that I knew the truth, I understood how important it was that she let go of Junie in her own time. For the next few weeks, things were quiet. School became a haven for me in the wake of my personal issues. My ex was still causing problems, and I was at the end of my rope dealing with him. Before we go further, I should probably give you some background on my sham of a marriage. I met my ex at a party through a mutual friend. We had a whirlwind romance and got married a year later. I got pregnant on the honeymoon, and gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Sounds perfect, right? Wrong. Because then came my mother-in-law. If you've ever been on the Gmail subreddit, let me tell you, this woman was up there with the worst of them. I thought about posting there, but I didn't want to deal with the potential legal ramifications while the divorce was ongoing. This woman hated my guts from day one. They were the typical single mother and only son tale. Ex's father died young and mommy thought her son was her replacement husband. Any woman he dated was competition. There's even a story where she faked a heart attack on prom night so he'd stay home with her. Unfortunately, my ex never truly escaped her clutches. Around our son's first birthday, he finally gave in and left me. He wanted full custody as opposed to the joint custody I was seeking. I know for a fact this was Mill's doing. She would have killed me herself if it meant keeping me away from her precious boys. That day, while the kids were at recess, I was sitting alone in the classroom, and all my pent-up emotions burst through the floodgates. It was looking more and more like I'd lose custody of my son. Mill had spun some bullshit story about me smoking while pregnant and neglecting my parental responsibilities in favor of work. Every word of it was a lie, but she was a hell of an actress. I wouldn't have put it past her to bribe the judge either. She came from a wealthy family. The final hearing was in 3 days. After the last one, I'd overheard my ex and Mill talking outside the courtroom. Soon we'll be a mommy and daddy together. She was saying, I feel like throwing up just thinking about it. So there I was, crying my eyes out at my desk. Not caring if any wayward janitor spotted me. I didn't even hear the tiny steps of someone walking into the classroom. I lifted my head to blow my nose, and there she was. Lily. Staring at my tear-stained, snot-covered face like this was a completely normal occurrence. Are you sad? She asked. I quickly composed myself. It wouldn't do for a student to see their teacher in this state. I attempted a smile, which probably looked awful. No, sweetie, I'm fine. Everything's fine. She tilted her head to one side. But you were crying. It's nothing. Just adult things. Nothing for you to worry about. Junie says you're sad. Is it your baby? For a moment, my heart stopped. I didn't know where the hell she'd come up with that. Then I remembered 3 days ago, when I got so mad at my lawyer for dragging his feet, I screamed at him for 5 minutes straight in the hallway. Got a reprimand from the principal for that one. It wouldn't have been weird if Lily overheard. Her desk was in the front row right by the door. I'm just having a tough time, Lily, I said, sucking back more tears. Sometimes, grown-ups have tough times, and we have to find a way to deal with it, but you don't have to worry about me. I'll be okay. Oh. Lily said, hanging her head. She was silent for a few seconds, her eyes closed as if she was deep in thought. Then she grinned excitedly. Ms. Carson, I just asked Junie, and she said if you want, she'll help you. I was taken aback to say the least. She'll help me? Only if you want her to. She doesn't like to help if no one thanks her. So will you let Junie help? She looked so bright, you'd never believe the horrors she'd witnessed. She was like any other child, just looking for the satisfaction of having the answer to a grown-up problem. It felt ridiculous, because obviously this girl's invisible friend could do no more to sway the judge in my favor than she could. But even though I knew it meant nothing, and even though it had been curdling in the back of my mind for months just how off this Junie thing was, I didn't have it in me to snuff out her light. It would be wonderful if Junie could help. She smiled like I'd just offered her a box full of kittens. Yay. I promise Junie won't let you down, Ms. Carson. I'm sure she won't. Thank you, Lily. You're welcome. Just remember to thank Junie, too, when she's done. I will definitely thank her, I said, hoping the conversation would end here and she'd go back outside to recess. Then Lily grabbed my hand. She looked at me like she was the adult and I was the child who had to be protected. I mean it, Ms. Carson. You have to thank Junie. She doesn't like it when she isn't thanked. I didn't like her tone. Not because it was rude or backtalk. It was just wrong. No 5-year-old should ever sound like that. Even knowing what I did about her origins, it stayed with me for the rest of the day and into the evening. I got home late after picking my son up from daycare. A long, slow night awaited me as I put him to bed and shuffled into the study. My lawyer had emailed me a newly revised list of conditions for the settlement. I'd need to look it over carefully before he sent it off to X's lawyer, where it would no doubt be rejected. Again. Then there was the mountain of paperwork I'd been putting off and the homework grades due tomorrow. I hadn't even looked at the latter yet. At least the assignment this week was an easy one: draw a picture of your family and write a short paragraph describing them. A pretty standard exercise, but one I'd employed successfully in the past. Once I got a student drawing her parents horizontal with "my mommy and daddy like to hug in bed" written under it. Otherwise, it was perfectly harmless fun for the kids. I almost skipped it anyway. I swear I wasn't trying to single her out, but I just didn't know how Lily would take it. Turns out, not too badly. In her usual scribbly stick figures were 5 people, 2 adults and 3 children. Aunt Melissa had a blob of orange on her head and Uncle Isaac wore glasses and a tie. On Lily's left was Cousin Bobby, in a red shirt and short pants. To the right, Cousin Kelly had a bow in her hair. They held Lily's hands. Everyone was smiling. "This is my family," Lily wrote. "I live with my aunt and uncle and cousins. We like to eat dinner and play games. My uncle takes us in his car and we sing songs. My family very nice and loves me. I love my family." Short, sweet, and to the point. I wrote a big 100 in the corner with a gold star. Hers was the last one I looked at that night. There were still a few left, but I decided it could wait until morning. Better to get all that paperwork and legal BS out of the way first. I was reading and signing things well into the early hours. My son woke up once or twice as babies do. I rocked him back to sleep, not wanting to let him go. I felt like if I did, Mill would pop out of the shadows and snatch him away. By 3:30, I was exhausted. I needed to be up and ready to go by 7, but it was looking increasingly like I'd be taking a personal day. As I slogged through the last few pages of the divorce agreement, I thought back to my encounter with Lily. It seemed like a silly thing to dwell on, but I couldn't help it. I wish I could go back in time and take a picture of her face when she told me I absolutely had to thank Junie for helping me. Would make it so much easier to explain how unsettling it was. I drafted a reply to my lawyer. I decided I'd sent it after I got some sleep and corrected all the mistakes I most definitely made. At a creak in the hall, I looked up. I almost screamed. Like a child, I closed my eyes, thinking that would make it go away. When I opened them, the doorway was empty. A wall ornament I bought at the fair and a few faded crayon marks were all I saw. No sign of Lily Barrett, ramrod straight and so still she blended into the background. Staring at me. Smiling. I leapt out of my chair and spent the next half hour checking every room in the house. Every closet, cabinet and crawl space, but I found nothing. All the doors and windows were bolted. Nothing had been moved or stolen. As my heart stopped pounding and the adrenaline keeping my body in motion drained away, I remembered how very tired I was. So tired it was messing with my head. Making me see things that weren't there. I was brushing my teeth when the doorbell rang. For a split second, I wanted to hide, and then I kicked myself for how stupid I was being. I went to open the door, and there were no creepily staring little girls on my porch. Just a pair of cops. "Are you Audrey Carson?" One of them asked. "Yes," I said, holding the door frame. I could still stand without assistance, but that wouldn't be the case for long. What's this about? They glanced at each other, their faces solemn. I don't think either of them wanted to be there. Mrs. Carson, it's your husband. I'm sorry, but there's been an accident. I remember the rest of the night more like a movie than a real event. My ex died at the scene, and when I got to the hospital, they took me straight to the morgue to identify the body. I won't describe what he looked like. Let's just say the wake was closed casket. My Mill was still alive, but her internal wounds were so extensive that no one expected her to make it through the night. I sat outside as the doctors worked on her. The screaming still echoes in my ears when it gets too quiet. She was always a shrill woman, especially when she was angry, but I'd never heard sounds like that come from a human throat. Get them out of me. They're in my skin. The bugs are in my skin. They're eating me. Hold her arms, someone shouted. Another voice said something about her BP levels dropping, but Mill drowned it out. Please make it stop. She's in me. She's tearing me apart. Please. She was gone by sunrise. I didn't go back to work for 2 weeks. Between talking to the police and making funeral arrangements, I barely had time to breathe. They never found out exactly what caused the crash. Best anyone could figure, my ex lost control of the car and drove into a tree. The windshield was shattered, which would explain the state his body was in. As for Mill's dying screams, well, she wouldn't be the first to have wild hallucinations at the end. It was all very logical and reasonable. For a while, I even believed it. On my first day back, only a few people gave me condolences. Most of them didn't know what to say, which is fair because I didn't know what to think. I may not have loved my ex anymore, but that didn't mean I wanted him dead. I was still processing everything. I probably should have asked for another week off. In class, I set the kids up watching an educational video. I had a few more ready to go and figured I'd keep them glued to the screen all day while I sat at my desk and pretended I was home in bed. Lily would not stop staring at me. I noticed it immediately. She was hyper-focused on me the way her classmates were focused on Arthur. The longer it went on, the more my skin crawled. I kept checking to make sure nothing was moving underneath. Sometimes, it felt like invisible hands were pressing against my chest, slowly crushing my rib cage. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Worst of all, I couldn't dismiss it as my overactive imagination like I did seeing her in my house. I knew it was real just like I knew my ex was an excellent driver. It was raining that day, so recess was held in the gymnasium. Lily was the last to leave when the bell rang. She sat at her desk organizing her things. Her lunch that day was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with apple slices. She still had a few apples left and she ate them slowly while staring at a fixed point on the wall. I watched her carefully. If I looked away, I could feel her eyes on me. She hadn't spoken a single word since the day began, and that silence was completely alien to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the girl at that desk was not Lily Barrett. And if this wasn't Lily, then neither was the girl in my house. I scratched all the way up my arm. They were both so itchy, I couldn't stand it. That's when I remembered. It hit me so hard, I forget about any discomfort I was in. My whole body screamed at me to stay where I was and not go near her, but I made myself stand and I forced my feet forward. She kept staring, raising her head little by little as I got closer. Lily, I stopped to swallow. Her eyes narrowed and something tugged at my chest. It felt like fingers wrapping around my heart. I felt cold, and I could do little more than whisper. "Junie?" She said nothing, just waited. She was so still. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop shaking. I wondered if this was how Antelope felt when cornered by a hungry lioness. I just wanted to say thank you for helping me. I truly appreciate everything you've done, and I was rambling and knew I should stop, but I had to phrase this right. From the bottom of my heart, Junie, thank you. She smiled, but it wasn't bright. There wasn't a shred of anything happy or pleasant or human to be found. The last time I came that close to vomiting, I'd just seen my ex with half his face torn off. Even worse was when she spoke. Her voice was still Lily's, but altered somehow. Like a voice from the depths of history, since long before humankind existed. She only said 2 words, but I'll never forget them, or how much they made me feel like withering away into dust. You're welcome. It's been a year since that day. Lily is in 1st grade now. Her teacher is a friend of mine and she always says Lily is one of her best students. Sometimes I see her in the hall with her friends. She wears her hair in a ponytail and always has scraped knees from playing soccer. The other day, I passed her classroom and one of her art projects was hanging outside. It was another drawing of her family, only this time the words "my new cousin" were written on the side with an arrow pointing to her aunt's rounded stomach. I'm doing well myself. My son is an energetic 2-year-old who loves dinosaurs and chicken fingers. I continue to enjoy my job, not looking to go back to high school anytime soon. I even have a new boyfriend with a little girl my son's age. They get along well, though I suspect it's because neither of them have reached the cooties phase yet. One day my son will ask me about his father, and I don't know what I'm going to say when he does. I've never told anyone this story, and after today, I never will again. Because I don't know what to believe. It all sounds so crazy, but I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. That's what keeps me from fully rationalizing the events of my ex-husband and Mel's deaths. Whenever I see Lily, she smiles and waves at me. Her whole face lights up, and I make sure to always wave back. At night, after tucking my son in and kissing him goodnight, I go to my room and say my prayers like the good Christian girl I was raised to be. After I've thanked God for all my blessings, I lay in bed and scratch an itch on my arm, like a line of ants crawling across my skin. And I thank Junie again. Story 6, I found a secret room in my grandfather's house. You need to be strong, little one. That was the last thing I remembered my grandfather saying to me. I don't mean that those were his last words, as that was something along the lines of oof, but that was the last thing he ever said to me. He fell asleep about an hour after he said that and never woke up. We may have talked about something else before he fell asleep, but I don't remember it. We could have been talking about the Mets, some Stephen King book that both of us read 10 years ago, or I could have been complaining about work. Grandpa Rich had this way of making anyone he was talking to feel important. And I sat in front of this wonderful man's bed as the machines stopped beeping in their regular rhythm. I cried as the doctor came in and pronounced him dead. I spoke nice words about the parts of his life that I knew and told everyone how much I appreciated the fact that he basically raised me when his son decided to abandon his duties of being a father one day at a time at the neighborhood bar. I'm not sorry to say it made me happy when my grandfather left everything to me in his will. Let my old man drink his own salary. The biggest portion of the will, by far, was the house he had lived in for the last 30 years. My first instinct was to live in that house. It felt like home. Too much like home. Every picture of my grandpa brought back old memories. Both of us posing in front of a Klimt painting in a touring show. Him showing a gold-toothed smile during a fishing trip we took just after I graduated high school. Even past the pictures on the wall there were the trinkets of a person's lifetime. So you can understand why I decided to sell the house. The house was cluttered with the type of things you would expect a man in his 80s to have. Old furniture, drawers full of outdated tools and a little mountain of newspapers stretching back to the mid-90s. So for the past couple of weeks I've been working through my grandpa's house and throwing out piles of detritus large enough that it required me to rent a dumpster. It was the third day when I was going through the living room that I found the secret room. I was unloading the bookcase in the living room, taking off the books one at a time and deciding what to keep and what to donate, when I tried moving a book on the third shelf. It didn't have any title on its spine and expected to find some unknown pulp novel from the 60s. Instead the book clicked when I attempted to pull it out of the bookcase. Instead of the solid bookcase it was a second ago I had a door that opened onto a set of steps heading into the ground. However old the mechanism was, it still worked as intended and the bookcase slid open as easily as a normal turn. No squeaks of rusted parts or worn machinery. Just the moving sounds of a well-oiled mechanism. The stairs led down into what looked like the basement. I had been in that basement many times growing up and I knew there was only one set of stairs, the ones in the kitchen, that went into it. I thought for a second about not going down. But of course I was going to go down. This was Grandpa Rich's house. The man who basically raised me into the man I am today. There's nothing he could have down there that would make me think less of him. This was wrong, of course, because there were plenty of things I could have found that would make me think less of him. And I wish I had found any of the things I thought of at that moment instead of what I found. So I went down the steps. It didn't take long, just a few steep steps, and I was there. It was about the size of a bathroom and contained a small desk, chair, and 2 metal filing cabinets. There was a piece of paper on the small desk. Adam, if you've found this room there will be trouble in your future. I know you, and you are strong. Be strong, little one. I opened the top drawer of the filing cabinet. Rows and rows of large folders with ridiculous amounts of paper in them. I took one at random and looked at the front. Someone had written Becky on the front in Sharpie. I took in a breath and opened the folder. The first couple of sheets looked like they had been crumpled at some point. I took one out to examine and see if I could find anything. It was junk mail. An advertisement for the local Sears advertising a small boxy TV for $700. The advertisement had the name Becky Armstrong and an address in Minneapolis. I put the junk mail back and looked through the folder. There was more mail. All of it to Becky Armstrong in Minneapolis. Behind the junk mail there was a birthday card from her grandmother wishing her a happy 25th birthday. Behind the junk mail and the personal mail there was something else. A small Ziploc bag with a tooth in it. I put the Becky file back and grabbed another one at random. It was the same thing. A bunch of mail to a Daniel Tibbetts in Minneapolis and a small Ziploc bag with a tooth in it. After looking at these 2 files I decided to see if my intuition was pointing me in the right direction and I pulled my phone out of my pocket. My intuition was correct, unfortunately. Becky Armstrong went missing in 1982. Daniel Tibbetts went missing in 2001. I resisted the urge to pull out more files and look up more names. I called the police instead. It took about an hour before 2 detectives finally came over and checked out the secret room. Once they knew they had something serious on their hands they called the station and a team of cops trampled through the entire house, taking anything they thought might have some significance to what they ended up calling the Tooth Fairy killings. The filing cabinets had over 50 different names in them. From what the cops told me later and what I learned on the news they were able to connect each and every file to either a missing persons case or an unidentified murder victim in the last 36 years. Everyone except one. The cops showed me the photo of the only person they couldn't connect directly. This was because it was the only folder in the filing cabinets that was missing a tooth. The photo showed a young man smiling at the camera with a gold incisor. A gold incisor. I left the detective who was sitting on my grandfather's couch and went into the hallway towards the downstairs bedroom to look at a certain photo. A photo from a fishing trip we took when I was 15. A photo where Grandpa Rich smiled at the camera, showing off a solid gold incisor. R/Corder 23. Story 7, The C-Section. My grandfather, a man whom, by all accounts, was hardly a spiritual man, lived in the belief that not only does the devil exist, but he walks the earth. He cannot be seen. He cannot be heard. He does not leave writings on the walls. He does not leave deals requiring a blood signature in the mail. He is merely present. And his presence alone sows the seed of unspeakable evil within the hearts of men. And before long, the root of an abhorrent and disgusting tree buries itself so deep, that the person becomes something other than human. Something malicious and cruel. Something that makes you doubt if they had ever been human, once the story is all said and done. It sounds melodramatic, I know. However, in my grandfather's case, I would call it a coping mechanism. Being a homicide detective for over a decade leaves a man with scars. As much as he tried to keep his cool in his early years, it started to get to him. My grandmother would tell us about how, at some point, he had begun to constantly roll around in his sleep, silently whimpering, before jerking himself awake in a cold sweat. On nights like those, she pulled him into her arms and ran her fingers through his hair until he managed to pass out. Yet, he refused to give in to the nightmares. He never ran from a case. Never looked away even at the worst of scenes. Never broke eye contact. Kept himself clean-shaven and well-dressed. Knew how to smile in such a way as to always brighten the room. He was broken. But he would not allow himself to crumble. At least, not until 1972. A woman called Patricia Lindoff had been found dead in her apartment. It had been a particularly hot summer, so the decomposition process had accelerated, causing a putrid stench to welcome my grandfather as he stepped into the crime scene. Mosquitoes had, by that point, infested the entire living room. The buzzing alone made the investigation frustrating. The coroner found their incessant biting to be far worse. Even so, they were professionals, and the investigation was conducted in the usual manner. The apartment was fairly small. According to the neighbors, Patricia lived alone. The only visitor she ever had was her boyfriend of 3 years, Arthur Macmillan. Due to there being no signs of forced entry, he was the investigative team's initial suspect. However, after establishing that he'd been out of the country at the suspected time of the murder, he was quickly ruled out. Patricia had been unemployed and lived off of welfare checks. She rarely ever went out, and thus had few chances of making enemies. The word stalker quickly found itself leaping from mouth to mouth. However, as they soon discovered, the culprit's intentions were much more sinister than they imagined. Her belly's been ripped open, the coroner said at one point. Patricia Lindoff had been 8 months pregnant at the time of her murder. According to the coroner, the killer had sedated her and performed surgery, in which he had extracted the baby from her womb. After doing so, he suffocated her while she was still unconscious. This revelation immediately made the situation more complex. The killer was now potentially in possession of a baby that could, as far as they knew, still be alive. The murder case had suddenly turned into that of a kidnapping. The buzzing of the mosquitoes, as if mocking them, grew louder. The coroner continued to provide some additional clues that could help identify the killer. For one, the procedure performed was hardly a trivial one, suggesting that the culprit must have had some sort of medical knowledge. The incision on the womb supported as much to begin with. The coroner also noted that it was likely that the killer had access to surgical equipment, as well. Secondly, due to an absurdly low amount of blood on the scene, it was highly probable that the surgery and the murder had been performed somewhere else, and that she had been brought to her apartment by the killer afterwards. Third, given that none of her other organs had been touched, it was a fairly safe bet that she had not been the victim of organ trafficking. The bastard was only after the baby. My grandfather immediately realized something was strange. Why had the killer simply not waited until the baby had been born? Why risk such a dangerous procedure? It made no sense. The coroner's final observation was, while the least helpful investigation-wise at the time, also the most mysterious one. There was something unhealthy about the fetus. It was obvious just by examining the womb. It appeared to have been damaged from the inside, as evidenced by several tiny holes, ones that had to have occurred roughly 2 months earlier. The police quickly established a timeline of events, and concluded that Patricia's body had been brought to her apartment a day before she was discovered. Questioning neighbors, they found that the only suspicious presence that night was that of a Cadillac 62, parked directly across from Patricia's apartment building. They decided to assume, for the time being, that this was the killer's car. Unfortunately, the investigation quickly stonewalled. Anyone could have been stalking Patricia and ambushed her at some point. They had no fingerprints, no blood, nothing. And, by extension, no suspects. On a hunch, my grandfather decided to visit Patricia's doctor, Dr. Maxwell Hodges. Hodges was a man in his mid-40s. Tall. Well-built. Came from a decent family. Highly intelligent and all around liked in the hospital he worked in. That said, my grandfather felt that his demeanor was puzzling. The news of Patricia's murder did not seem to have much effect on the man. This wasn't that surprising, given the fact that a doctor as experienced as Hodges likely developed a certain amount of distance between himself and his patients. As a result, there's only so much shock and surprise one can show. All she had done was come for checkups, after all. But when he brought up the possibility that something had been wrong with the pregnancy, the doctor seemed to become far more defensive than he should have. He vehemently denied the coroner's findings, and concluded that whatever holes they had discovered must have occurred after her death. Had it been an attempt to keep doctor-patient confidentiality? Unlikely, as he had no reason to be confidential, given that the patient was dead. Had he been attempting to hide that he had made a mistake during one of the checkups, and that he had simply covered up a problem? The reaction had been too strong, even for that. Later that day, a vagabond had come across what investigators believed was Patricia's umbilical cord. It had been tossed away near some train tracks. An examination of it uncovered yet another strange clue. One end of it seemed deformed, far thinner than it should have been. It also appeared to have been 5 inches longer than the average length. Another sign that something had not been right with the pregnancy. At this point, my grandfather had developed a theory. The killer was Dr. Hodges. He had made an error in his examination of Patricia's pregnancy. The child would likely not have been born healthily, and once it was revealed that the signs should have been caught by the attending physician, Hodges' career would have been damaged. So, he killed Patricia, and removed the fetus in an effort to cover up his tracks. A sick and twisted plan, but not the most horrific that my grandfather had come across. Once my grandfather found out Hodges drove a Cadillac 62, it felt like hammering the last nail into the coffin. He got a warrant to search the doctor's home and car. While the investigative team was at the hospital, confronting the doctor and conducting the search of the Cadillac, my grandfather headed over to the home, in hopes of having a look around for himself before it got too crowded. It was another fiendishly hot day. Hodges lived in a relatively quiet suburban neighborhood. So quiet that the faint humming of the mosquitoes was the only thing that followed my grandfather as he approached the house's front lawn. It was quite large, as expected, for a man that had the salary of a doctor. All the curtains were drawn. Hodges, according to the neighbors, kept to himself. An eternal bachelor, as the old lady next door put it. Picking the lock proved to be relatively easy. As he stepped into the darkness of the house, my grandfather was immediately struck by an overwhelming odor. Like rotten eggs. And old iron. When recounting the story, he sometimes even brought up the mention of garlic. But he admitted that, whatever it had been, it was something that had never entered his nostrils before. The house proved to be rather devoid of furniture. Slam. My grandfather drew his gun. He'd heard something in the house. Slam. He wasn't alone. Slam. As much as he called out though, he received no response. Best that he could tell, something was repeatedly hitting the wall. Given the amount of mosquitoes, he also compared it to the sound of a fly swatter. Slam. The sound grew louder as he approached the stairs to the basement. It always had to be the basement. He readied a pocket flashlight to fight against the darkness swallowing the stairs before him. Grime had infested the stone walls. Dust had enveloped the white sheets covering old furniture. His footsteps were occasionally disrupted by the sound of glass quietly cracking. And, of course, slam. It was definitely there. Whatever it was. Once again, he called out. This time, his response was a faint whine. The baby? It could have been, for all he knew. The faint buzzing from upstairs urged him to keep pushing forward. The air was damp, but cold. The basement felt like a maze. But he knew something awaited him. Running away would have changed nothing. My grandfather was the kind of man that would never forgive himself if he simply turned back on his fear. Even if it was something awful. Even if it were to follow him in his dreams. Letting the fear win felt like an admission of his loss. He would not, accept it. I think that decision would be the one he came to regret the most. What awaited him at the end was not a baby silently crying in its crib. It was not a housemate that had for some reason come to the basement to swat flies in the dark. Most frighteningly, it was not a hallucination. No. It had certainly existed. It had been the one causing the slamming. Its enormous hole-ridden wing had been slowly hitting against the wall behind it, likely in an attempt to try and fly. Of course, it could do no such thing, given that the other wing had been firmly imprisoned against the wall with nails. As such, it squirmed, dangling its long, thin limbs, desperately trying to be free. With a wild swing of its thin, but hairy arm, a splash could be heard. Blood. Some muscles had overgrown the shell of its skin, causing profuse bleeding. 3 of its ribs had emerged from its chest, covered in bundles of capillaries. They were pulsing. It had bones, it seemed. It was only when he saw its head that he noticed a similarity. A thin, needle-like shape was in the place of its mouth. It seemed someone had connected it to a tube, which led to a large blood bag stationed in the corner of the room. My grandfather's hands began to tremble. One of its eyes was larger than the other. Grey patches of hair could be seen on its forehead. It had no mouth. So how had it been making noises? How had it been squealing? The answer was something in its chest. But whatever it was, my grandfather did not dare investigate. Looking down, he noticed a large transparent sac dangling from the thing. In spite of its size, it looked to have barely been filled up with the crimson liquid it was designed to keep. The thing seemed indifferent to my grandfather's presence. It merely continued to squeak, and slam its freed wing against the wall. Its legs continually slipped on a dark liquid that had formed around it, the source of the overpowering smell from earlier. I don't know what happened. A voice from somewhere spoke. It was the doctor. After the police appeared to search his car, he snuck away and raced home in a taxi, in an attempt to do something about the thing before anyone inevitably found it. He explained that, at first, he was certain that he'd been hallucinating when he saw Patricia's ultrasound. But as the months progressed, the more certain he became of the monstrosity that was forming in her belly. On the 6th month of her pregnancy, Patricia had found herself in an emergency room, after the thing had broken through the placenta with its limbs, lodging them in the flesh of her womb. The fact that it had not moved them afterwards prevented the amniotic sac from bursting completely and pushing her into labor. But it had been a close call. At that point, the doctor decided to do something. The childbirth would likely result in both the child and Patricia dying. And, in turn, expose the fact that he had withheld important information on the whole matter. Time was running out. By then, however, he had developed a certain fascination for the creature. He spent his nights pondering how it must have felt inside poor Patricia. Did it hurt, when it moved in its sleep? It must have. But she, being the good mother, suffered in silence, believing she would get to hold her beautiful baby boy in her hands when the time came. That it would all be worth it. The image of the future diluting the grim present. It was love. One that only a parent could understand. The doctor snickered at the irony, given the fact that the being had at some point begun to gradually store some of the blood that came to it through the umbilical cord. It was, quite literally, bleeding Patricia dry. Yet, things like that made the creature all the more intriguing to him. He wanted to know more about it. To study it. Understand it. Find its origin. At some point, Patricia's own existence became trivial. So, he called her over to his home for a private checkup, sedated her, extracted the child and killed her, to ensure her silence. Over the next few days, the monstrosity grew to 5 feet. In fear, the doctor nailed its wings to the wall. In spite of the situation drastically changing, the doctor's determination to discover more about it did not falter. But the investigation caught up with him too soon. And thus, in the end, all he could say was, "I don't know what happened." Enraged, my grandfather shot the doctor then and there. He then placed 3 bullets into the thing. 2 in its chest, 1 in its head. For good measure, he ripped the tube from the thing's proboscis, and threw it in the corner with the blood bag. When he was sure the creature had stopped moving, he lit a candle, set off a gas leak, and left. Whatever witness had seen him arrive in the first place had never gotten a good look at his face. The old lady next door had almost said something during questioning, but was smart enough to know when to keep her mouth shut. After blood was found in the trunk of the doctor's car, the case was ruled to be closed. Unable to face the guilt of his actions, he committed suicide. My grandfather never discovered how the thing in the basement had come to be. The doctor was gone, and Patricia's boyfriend, Arthur Macmillan, was nowhere to be found by the time the dust had settled. The affair faded into obscurity, but not from my grandfather's memory. My mother was conceived 3 months after. According to my grandmother, the 9 months that followed it were the worst of my grandfather's life. I cannot say that I share my grandfather's sentiment when it comes to the existence of the devil. What I can say is that, if there is such a thing as a God, he is neither loving nor merciful. Story 8, I downloaded Ghost Find. Boredom could never be more painful. I desperately grasped for anything to do that I'm willing to scroll down the App Store to find something interesting. Games were a #1 choice, but with the abundance of either endless indie games or really good games with really over-the-top prices, there's not much for me. One specific app caught my eye, though, Ghost Find. 4 stars and reviews were mostly modest. I clicked get and waited. After a while, I opened the app and quickly got oriented. It's a simple interface with a rotating black and green radar. It looped endlessly and its radius was about 4 feet from the phone. If there was a dot, it means a spirit is within the vicinity and a beeping sound would be heard. I stared at it for a good 1 hour. You'd think that staring aimlessly at a rotating green radar was the dumbest way to fight boredom. I never really got bored. In fact, my thoughts were enough to fill me with joy. I just needed the app to channel it. I snapped out of my thoughts and grabbed her bottle of beer on the fridge. I've been having a lot of that since then and I think I'm gonna need more. Supplies already getting dry anyway. As I opened the bottle, I heard it. A low beeping sound came from my bedroom. I went back to check out what's happening and sure enough it was the phone. The app was open and blinking. 1 green dot can be seen beside the center of the radar. The dot went fuzzy for a moment then returned back to its round, clear shape. Below the radar, there were words, scrambled at first but was rearranged to form one phrase. Please don't leave me. I felt chills behind my neck. I clicked help to investigate what I just saw. Turns out the app can also tell you what a ghost detected by the radar says. I couldn't help but laugh as the beeping sound continues. The sheer absurdity of that feat somehow lightened myself, even at that time. I put down my phone and continued with my beer. Brushing away all the notices, hospital bills and memos, I found the can opener. The beeping stopped as I drank my beer and watched some random guy talk about crocodiles. Given the show, it's easy for me to fall asleep through the volume of the TV. I woke up about 2 hours later to a beeping sound from my phone. The goddamn app was opened and a single green dot rests at the center of the screen. I should be annoyed, but the message that accompanied the noise filled me with terror instead. Everywhere you are, I'll be there. I jumped back, confused. For a cheap app, that was specific. I checked the time. 4:35 a.m. I turned off the TV and headed back to my bedroom. It was trashed and under-maintained. I put my phone to silent and put it beside the frame. I dropped asleep to my bed instantly and was only awoken by the incessant alarm clock, reminding me of a new Monday ahead. I groaned as I turned it back off and began to snuck back under the covers. I tried falling asleep again, but another buzzing kept me awake. I got up and looked at my phone. No text messages or calls, just the app. Frustrated, I checked it out before finally getting rid of it. 1 green dot, the usual. I was about to uninstall it when a loud bang happened. The frame fell and glass broke. I rushed to it, tearing up. The picture of my family lay there along with broken glass. I suddenly realized something. It moved by itself. Beep beep beep. I jumped. The sound came from the phone. It was loud and ominous. My phone lay in the bed. Beep beep beep. That beep sound echoed throughout the room now. Its shrill tone drilled through my head. I picked up my phone and pressed home. It didn't follow. Beep beep beep. It's lagging, but Ghost Find was still running. The radar still rotating, with one dot in the center. It suddenly went fuzzy. Beep beep beep. The sound continued. The dot blurred for a while. I tried everything to exit the app. Home button, power button, anything. The dot suddenly stood still and the words manifested at the bottom of the screen. Beep beep beep. It wasn't much of a whole sentence. It was jumbled like before, then it was rearranged. Dad, it's okay. It read, but now it had a sound. At first, the sound seemed to come from the phone, but it soon became clear where it was coming from. Behind me. The words were narrated in a child's voice. A voice I knew. I turned around. Beep beep beep. Then our eyes met. His was scared and bloodshot. Mine was confused and teary. He wore the same clothes he did that day. He had the same wounds he got that day. He had the same look as I pulled him out of the car seat. Maybe I was dreaming, maybe I was going crazy, but he was more real now than the last day I saw him. The dot went fuzzy again and words came jumbled, but as it was rearranged, he already spoke. I know it's hard, but please, Dad, you need to move on. Everything came flashing back. The ride, the rain, the impact of the car to the trees, blood everywhere, and the sounds of sirens as 911 responded. It was my fault, that was clear. Beep beep beep. The beeping still continued, but I didn't care. Wiping my face, I hugged my son. He seemed calm and peaceful. As soon as we touched, he was gone just as suddenly as he arrived. That was a week ago and now I'm recovering. My son might be gone, but I'll always remember the words the app flashed before he disappeared. I'll always be here when you need me. I haven't deleted the app. I don't think I have any intention to. I'm writing this review to tell you this. Ghost Find is great. Rating, 5 stars. Story 9, Care. I love it when I have the break room all to myself when I eat lunch. I don't know why, but I just prefer to be by myself during that time. I decided on Chick-fil-A, like many other days, and it was as good as it always is. When I was done, and had that last few minutes before I got back to work, I thought about my mother's cooking. I love fast food, don't get me wrong, but I had not been back home in quite some time. Nothing compares to food cooked by your mother. There is always that something that I cannot explain that is like that little extra squeeze when someone gives you a hug. It is more than food. Working in retail kind of makes you oblivious to certain things. When you get into a rhythm, everything around you turns into background noise, at least for me. So as I stood there, opening box after box, stocking the shelves, it took a minute for me to realize that it had become completely quiet besides the music playing from the store's speakers. This was not completely out of the ordinary. There are times when it is comfortably quiet, like when the first few of us show up in the morning to begin the day, or when the last of us remaining are tidying up the store before we leave and lock it up. But this was different. It was in the middle of the afternoon, on a weekday, just a few days before school started back up. I put my box cutter down, listened, and did not hear a single sign of a person. I walked around and no one seemed to be in the store. Not even any of my coworkers. I was starting to get a bit worried. Did everyone just leave when I was at lunch? Was there some kind of emergency? As I got closer to the front end of the store, my questions were answered. Everyone was outside looking up at the sky. When I stepped outside, I could sense the urgency amongst the crowd even before I looked up. Worried whispers, frantic conversations being had on phones, cars screeching out of the parking lot. When I looked to see the source of everyone's panic, I had no idea what to think. It was a circle, about the size of the moon, and it was impossibly black. They're saying it's a black hole. Lindsay, one of my co-workers, seemed more in awe than worried. She always loved science fiction and space and things of that nature. There was a look on her face not of fear or dread of impending doom, but more of an accepting curiosity to the unknown. Panic would be the best way to describe how I felt. At that moment there was only one thing I could think about. I called my parents. Hey Mom, Alex, you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. You guys alright? Yay, Dad and Raymond are here. It's all over the news, every channel. There are scientists on CNN saying it's a black hole. They said it's really big, and it is moving towards us. I'm coming home, Mom. Turns out driving 4 hours home on the interstate when a black hole is approaching Earth is not the best idea. Basically, the interstate looked like what you would expect in that situation. There were more crashes and cars on the shoulder than I had ever seen. Cars were sometimes just bumping into cars and no one cared. Even police cars zoomed by ignoring the carnage taking place. Everyone had somewhere to go, and they were getting there by any means necessary. I even saw several helicopters in the sky when there was a standstill in traffic for about an hour. On the radio it was not better. People were talking about the end of the world and Judgment Day. Churches were being packed by the hundreds. The president made a speech saying all the things you would expect. One station had Rem's song "It's the End of the World" playing on repeat, which I thought was funny. Another station had an astronomer on who estimated the black hole to be larger than the Milky Way itself. He was about to give a timetable of when it would presumably consume our planet, but I changed the station. For some odd reason, I did not want to know that. What was usually a 4-hour trip took an excruciating 8 hours. When I arrived home, almost on cue, my mother, father, and brother came outside. I hugged them each individually, like I usually do. But each hug was longer and tighter. Afterwards we all did a collective hug and my father said a prayer. The days that passed were as chaotic you can imagine. The black circle in the sky grew larger and larger as it cast its shadow upon our fate. There was a lot of looting, people shouting in the streets asking for forgiveness. All around the world scenes of chaos erupting at such a feverish pace that I became numb to the madness. After a while we all decided it was best to not watch the television. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, our old VHS player still worked. Among the tapes with titles scratched out and new titles written with a child's handwriting were Many Christmas, Alec's Birthday, Raymond Graduation, things like that. I had not seen any of these in maybe 15 years. The Christmas when I got my first pair of Air Jordans, the trip my brother and I took to West Virginia where my father was stationed, my mother preparing Thanksgiving dinner. Tape after tape we watched, and laughed, and cried, and I realized that I really had not only a great life, but a great family. Those days of happiness we spent reminiscing were a welcome departure from the madness that was going on in the world and the threat that was looming in space. That happiness was short-lived, however, when the sky began to get dark. The last few days were odd. The world kind of stopped. There was no more looting or crime, the news anchors on television no longer had a worried look, and it was kind of peaceful. I think people had accepted that this was it. There was nothing that could be done. And it felt like this was it. First the power went out. Which was very scary. It was the hammer being pulled back when the pistol is pointing at your face. My mother started crying. She gave me a hug and in between tears asked me did I do a good job. You did the best job. For some reason, perhaps to get her mind off of things, my mother decided to make us supper. The Last Supper. We still had a gas grill and like many Filipino households, a lot of meat in the freezer. She asked me what I wanted and I asked her, can you make kare-kare? Kare-kare is a Filipino dish made with a peanut butter sauce, various vegetables, and usually oxtails. My mother's version is different, however. The sauce, which usually comes in packets, she makes by hand using fresh peanuts. There are other things she does, but I really never asked her about that. We all sat around the table holding hands as my dad said one last prayer. A bit of white rice, a piece of oxtail with some fat, piece of eggplant, peanut butter sauce, with a dab of bagoong, is in my mind, the best bite on the face of the earth. This bite was particularly delicious, more so than any time I can remember. My brother, who for some reason is not really a big fan of traditional Filipino dishes, went back for seconds. When we were done I grabbed my mother's hand and told her, "That was amazing, Mom." Like many people in our neighborhood, we decided to go outside and meet this fate head on. The sky was so dark now that you could not even see the stars. It almost looked fake. I cannot explain it, but you could feel it. I am sure there is a scientific explanation, but I am not sure what that is. There was also a massive circle along the edge of the sky, similar to the northern lights but a goldish color, dancing a cosmic dance around the massive black circle. It was actually very beautiful, almost welcoming. Then I felt it. And I am sure my family did, because we all came together and prayed. It felt like you were floating but still on the ground. I took one last peek up and all I saw now was the goldish light, dancing and shimmering like the sun bouncing off the crystal clear water of a flowing river. Then I closed my eyes. A memory appeared to me. My brother, father and I playing in a river in West Virginia. I was probably 7. The water was crystal clear. I looked in one direction of the river, and for a moment I could see not all the way down the river, but all the time of the river. It would dry up, then eventually be turned into a road, then crumble, then nothing. I looked in the other direction and not only could I see all the way down that way, but all the time before the river. When there was nothing, to when it was a tiny stream, all the animals over millennia stopping for a drink, to when there was nothing. Like in a dream I was immediately awoken to another memory. This time of my parents dropping me off at school. Some of the kids were crying but I was eager and happy to be amongst new friends in a new place. My mother knelt down and gave me a kiss and my lunch and they left. Then when I looked at all the kids in the room something happened. Not only did I see them as kids, all at the same time I saw them as kids, as teenagers, as adults, and so on, and I saw their kids, grandkids and so on. Memories kept coming back at an alarming pace and I could not tell which ones were real, or which ones were a figment of my imagination. They started with the earliest memory that I am positive took place, to other memories over the course of my life. They just started piling up, like I was reliving them for the first time. Or was it the first time? Were they memories? Eventually it got to high school, which I remember most of, then college which I remember all of, then yesterday, which I remember clearly. Today is my birthday. I came home to see my family because my mom asked me to, and also kind of to eat some of her food. A lot of it. When I arrived home there was a pot on the stove and I already knew what was inside it. I could smell it, almost sense it. Lol. I took a spoonful of white rice, some oxtail, eggplant and bagoong, put it to my nose and smelled it, then ate the glorious bite. Something, I am not sure what, was different. Story 10, The Headless Fairy. The memory of the night my grandmother passed away is perhaps the most clear of my entire childhood. Get in the car, Michael, my father had said while I sat on the floor, playing with my toys, we're going to see your grandmother. Why? I asked him, is grandmother making us tea and biscuits? A grandmother's tea and biscuits are always the best. No, my father said, his eyes dark and clouded, she's sick, Michael. Very sick. We have to go see her right now. Should I bring my pajamas? I asked. I could sleep over again. That would make her feel better. My father clenched his fist and tried to say something, but instead his mouth snapped shut as he bored into me with broken eyes. They weren't usually so strange and sad. I didn't understand why he would be. We'd visited grandmother a good many times before when she was sick. I was sure those visits helped her get better. Let him bring his pajamas, I heard mother say. She came up behind my father and gently rested a hand on his shoulder. Her eyes were also strange and sad, but not as hard as father's. All right, father said softly. But we have to go right now. Mother got my postman pat pajamas while father started the car. When I got into the booster seat, she buckled me in. Her hands felt cold. I noticed her eyes were somewhat damp. When I turned to my father, his were practically soaked. It was so hard to see them like this. Mum, Dad, I said, why are you crying? Grandmother will be all right. Both were silent for a few moments. My mother's hand rested on Dad's, and she gently began to rub it soothingly, like she did for me when I cut myself. Not this time, Michael, father sighed, not this time. The drive was quiet and still. I didn't say anything, just held my pajamas in my lap. My parents said nothing the whole way, aside from mother telling father which way he should go. He would only answer her with an I know or a thank you. Grandmother's house was way out in the country. It was a big, two-story house, with a low stone wall encompassing it, the driveway and the yard. Her gate was rusted at the joints and squeaked whenever it was opened. Tonight, we parked next to the wall. Father practically ran out of the car while Mother collected me. I watched as he pushed the gate open and then was inside the house. Mother closed the gate behind her carefully, but our pace was just as quick and tense. Inside, some of Grandmother's friends and neighbors were already present. Like me and her son, she was an only child. People like Mr. O'Brien, the local pig farmer, kept her company, as did that Macoun woman. I never liked her much, and now that I look back, I can't understand why. She was so eager to help out during the whole ordeal. Made me some lovely sandwiches. I heard people muttering about when the doctor would be here or how far Father Riley was. It was discomforting to hear them whispering to each other and giving me a look of sympathy whenever I asked them what was wrong. They never answered, though, just said I needed to go see Grandmother. When Mother finally led me upstairs, Father was clutching on Grandmother's hand tightly, as if he thought he could do so forever. Her arm was softly caressing his back, as she hummed softly. When Grandmother saw me enter, she smiled and patted her son's back a few times before lightly kissing his cheek. "I'd like some time alone with Michael," she said softly. "One last talk with him. Just the two of us." Father sniffed hard as he stood up, his every breath as unstable as a crooked wall. Without a word, he and Mother left the room, gently closing the bedroom door behind them. And so now I was left alone with my dear grandmother. "Oh, Michael," she said, extending her thin, wrinkled arms to me, "come here, my dear boy." She didn't look anything like herself. However, seeing the old, weak husk of a woman who, just months before, had been able to carry me on her shoulders without much trouble, was not particularly upsetting. She still had those same eyes full of deep, sincere love I'd grown to find safety in. I could hear my father crying downstairs, even through the closed oak door. It wafted up to the room and penetrated into me. The safety of my grandmother's eyes weren't a reassurance anymore. Her fingertips gently traced my cheeks as she smiled, keeping her lips pressed together. Her blonde hair descended down from her scalp in flowing curls, but I could see the clumps where it was falling out. "Oh Michael," she sighed, "dear boy. You know the old stories we shared together of the pucker and Fear-Derog? How the leprechauns play the fiddle as the little people dance?" I nodded, and smiled with her. Those were lovely stories. Stories of nature, old and mysterious, of the creatures which lived there and how we must be weary of them. "You know where I keep the book containing those tales? Go get it. There is one I must tell you about before I go." I didn't like how Grandmother said she would go. It sounded like we would never see each other again. Not even the passage of time and maturity has diminished how much I dislike them. But I was a good boy who did as I was told, and got the book. Grandmother's book was an old, dusty thing, bound by faded leather and decorated with intricate spirals. It was on a bookshelf which must be the same age, and thankfully just in reach for a child my age. It was a heavy book, and my small body struggled to hold it as I waddled back over to her. She hurried me along, all the while glancing outside the window into the night. Licking her dry lips with a dreadful anticipation, her eyes were searching for something. More than once she cocked her head to the side and listened before breathing a sigh of relief. I set the book down on her bed, and Grandmother opened it quickly, brushing through the pages filled with words I couldn't read but beautiful pictures of small men in wonderful clothes that I loved to trace over with pencil and paper. My grandmother had read this book to me many nights already, but in the short time we had together never could read me the whole thing. That undertaking I would perform on my own. On this night, she hurriedly flipped through the pages until she came to one in particular. My eyes were drawn immediately to the picture of a large black horse rearing on its back legs with horrible, furious eyes that gleamed with an ethereal power I could feel through even this illustration. There was a rider on its back, dressed in clothes of the same shade. Yet this rider had no head upon his shoulders, but instead held the rotted and grinning thing in his hand, the other holding a whip of bones. The head reminded me of moldy cheese. I shivered at the sight of it, gazing into unnaturally large eyes that shone with a sickly light. The grin plastered across it stretched from one ear to the other, exposing yellow, jagged teeth while the skin hung down off it in tatters. "Michael," grandmother said softly to me, "in this fine country of ours, there is no creature more terrible than the Dullahan. The Black Rider comes for those like me, Michael." "You mean, old people?" I asked, staring up at her with a quizzical expression. She laughed softly. "Sometimes, Michael, he comes for the elderly. But not all the time." "Why is he coming for you?" I asked, becoming distressed. "Is he going to take you away, grandmother?" "He can't. I won't let him." She smiled warmly at me, stroking my cheek with her knuckles. Michael, there's nothing you can do to stop him. Unless," and here she chuckled softly, without a hint of malice or mockery but only forlorn longing and affection, "you have some gold. He's terrified of the stuff." I blinked, and shook my head sadly. "What'll he do to you, grandmother? Will he hurt you?" "It's all right, Michael," she said again, patting my head, "I don't think he will." "What will happen?" She opened her mouth and this time I saw how many of her teeth, those lovely white teeth of hers, now were slightly brown with black stuff building between them. "He shall call my name, my love," she said sweetly, "and I shall go home to heaven, to be with your grandfather." "You don't remember him now, he went there before you were born." I knew enough about heaven to understand. Sniffling, I rubbed my nose on my sleeve. "Use a tissue, Michael, use a tissue," she said gently, "you'll get your lovely shirt all dirty." "I don't want you to go to heaven," I said with water streaming down my cheeks. "I want you to stay here and read me more stories." "Oh, Michael, don't cry," she said as she took my hand, "we all have to go one day. Tell you what, when it's your time, I'll make sure everything is perfect for you, and we can read so many stories together. Would you like that?" I nodded, and then she wrapped her thin arms around me, holding my body close to hers. A knock on the door interrupted us. "That'll be the doctor," grandmother sighed. "You'll have to now. But Michael, listen closely. Don't go outside tonight, and if you have to, the moment you hear the pounding of hooves and a horse screaming, I want you to lay face down, close your eyes and cover your ears. Don't open them no matter what, otherwise, you'll go blind, and we can't have that now, can we?" I shook my head as the door opened. The doctor, a tall, thin man in a white coat, was accompanied by the parish priest, Father Riley. The two men ushered me out of the room. As I saw the door swing back its hinges, my grandmother held my gaze one last time, her last farewell. But just before she was blocked from my sight, I saw her expression change as she seemed to recall something, and then there was a great panic in her eyes as the doctor inserted a needle into her arm. Then she was gone. It was against my weak protestations that my parents sent me to the car while they stayed in the living room. Mother took my hand and led me back, locking the doors after she gave me a kiss on the forehead. "Get your rest, Michael," she said to me, "your father wishes to be alone right now. We'll be out soon." They weren't. I waited for what felt like hours in that cold, freezing car, laying on the passenger seat as I tried to rest, but I could only think of my grandmother and her panic. That was my final memory of her. I pondered over it, turning it round and round in my head with all the brain power a 5-year-old could muster, but that isn't much to speak of. Then the doors unlocked. I sat up, expecting to see my parents coming round the side of the car doors, but nobody was there. Not a soul. Instead, all 4 doors swung slowly open, with no assistance from any living creature I could see. I stared out into the night, and saw the door of grandmother's house also lay open, the bright light of the house streaming out and illuminating the darkness. I jumped when I heard a crash from behind me and turned to see the gate had swung open all on its own. It bumped against the stone 3 times before coming to a rest. All was still and quiet, save the wind through the trees and my shallow gasps for air. It traveled through that same wind and wafted about me. The fear of this dark night and what it had to offer me. Something was coming. Something dark and dreadful. It came over the hill. The first tramping footfalls of hooves, faint but carrying a sinister power that no child should have familiarity with. Then I saw a faint, pale light in the distance, coming closer and closer as the tramping got louder and louder. It passed under the trees which adorned either side of the road, but through the leaves, moonlight trailed down and I saw a figure. A horse, far bigger than any I have ever seen since, was approaching fast, its face twisted into an angry grimace. Upon its back, I only briefly saw the rider, yet that glimpse sent a chill down my spine as grandmother's warning remained fresh and clear. The dark rider really had come. And I had no gold to protect myself or grandmother. For a moment I almost tried to run back inside the house, but I hesitated. And those wasted moments closed off that choice completely. The rider was coming too fast for any adult to hope to outrun it, let alone a child. I curled into a ball on the seat, closing my eyes tight and pressing my palms hard against my ears. I mustn't look nor must I listen, that's what grandmother had told me, but I could still feel the vibrations from every crashing hoof grow stronger. And then, as I finally heard the harsh snorting of the horse which overpowered every other sound, the tramping stopped for a moment. I almost considered opening my eyes to take a peek. But I knew grandmother would be so disappointed in me if I didn't listen to her last instructions. Then came a slow clopping which stopped just outside the open door. The horse's snorting was now so close I could feel the otherworldly presence with each breath, and it was accompanied by the dreadful odor of rotting flesh. I gagged but kept still through sheer fear. Then I felt something against my hair, blowing hot gusts of wind that washed across my soul. I shivered at a horrible sniffing sound that accompanied this, before cold, rough flesh pressed against the top of my head. Flesh I later came to know as that of a horse's nose. And then the Dullahan spoke my grandmother's name. His voice was loud and as full of sinister power as the rest of him and that horse, yet there was neither malice nor hate in it. Only pure solemnity. The horse gave a cry and the terrible pounding was back with full force, but this time it grew fainter and fainter, before finally fading away. Trembling, I finally uncurled myself and heard running footsteps. It was my parents. Mother kissed me when she saw I was all right and father couldn't stop looking up the road after the rider, shaking from head to toe. They scooped me up from the car before rushing back into the house, slamming the door shut. Inside, the other grown-ups were whispering to each other and badly shaken. The doctor inspected me for any injuries, yet found none. I overheard the priest remark that it was a miracle the rider of Cromdu didn't harm the child. We waited a good hour before going back to our house. Well past midnight. None of us slept at all, though I tried. Every night I did from then, I had nightmares of a demonic horse chasing me before it bit down and ripped the flesh from my bones. I came to dread sleep and prayed always for a pleasant dream, just one to bring an end to these horrific nights. But like all things, even those horrible nightmares drifted away and bothered me no more. Yet I will never forget that voice, nor the nightmares that came from my hearing it. For I know one day, I too shall hear it call my own name. Then I will finally be able to read stories with grandmother again. Story 11, I found a journal in the Hang Son Dong caves. My friend Sasha and I were exploring the Hang Son Dong in Vietnam, but somehow we got lost and now, something is stalking us. As we were being chased we stumbled upon another tent. We soon realized though, that it has been abandoned for a while now. Looking through the previous occupants' belongings, I found a journal. Maybe it will give us some sort of clue as to what exactly is lurking in this cave. Day 1, June 5, 1991. I finally found the rumored cave, but strangely enough, my guide refuses to enter. Anyway, just like what I heard, it's massive and even has its own jungle. I'm going to set up camp now and have a bite to eat, then afterwards, go to sleep. Day 2, June 6, 1991. Last night I heard noises outside my tent, and when I woke up this morning, I noticed that someone or something had ransacked through my belongings. I thought I was alone, so maybe it was an animal. Day 3, June 7, 1991. Last night, I heard the noises again, but I was too scared to even leave my tent. Now, I can't sleep. Day 4, June 8, 1991. I finally went to sleep but woke up to have a bite to eat. My meal was interrupted though after hearing a deafening scream coming from deep inside the cave. Maybe it was an animal, I don't know, but I do know that I'm debating whether or not I should stay here anymore. Day 7, June 10th, 1991. I've been holed in my tent now for the past 3 days. I'm too terrified to even leave, especially at night, because I've seen those things up close with their glowing eyes and their pale skin. I learned something today though. They are scared of light, so I need to make sure to keep a fire going at all times to keep them away. Day 9, June 12th, 1991. I'm afraid I'm running out of food now and I know that I won't last much longer here, so I have to leave before those things kill me or starvation takes me. Day 10, June 13th, 1991. Last night one of those creatures somehow managed to attack me and now I'm injured pretty bad. I managed to bandage my leg up where the creature bit me. I'll use some flares and maybe then, somebody will find me. Day 11, June 14th, 1991. This morning I woke up and I was vomiting. I feel so sick and I think I have a fever. I'm also feeling dizzy. The wound on my leg is becoming infected, so I have to hurry up and leave, before I end up dying in this place. Day 12, June 15th, 1991. I've become weaker now and am unable to tend to my fire, so it's starting to die. Day 13, June 16th, 1991. It's night and my fire has finally died. I can hear them outside my tent and I definitely know now that I won't be leaving this place alive. I've written my address down just in case somebody finds my journal. Please send it to my family back in the States so they'll be able to find some peace. To anybody thinking about visiting this cave, heed my warning and stay away. Thank you. John. I closed the journal after reading the last entry and noticed, it was dated back 27 years ago, 1 year before the cave was officially discovered. Now as Sasha and I sit here, I see those things getting closer and I swear to you I can see a man standing amongst those things.